Tonight, as you lie still, safe, and warm perhaps under the comfort of your own familiar blanket, or the soft ambient sound of the world around you muted and benign, allow your mind to drift into the distant past, to a place where silence was not a luxury, but a rule, where waking before dawn was not a choice, but a sacred obligation, and where time itself was measured not in minutes or hours, but in tolls of the bell, in the rhythm of devotion, in the repetition of prayer, labor, and submission. Imagine now that your bed is no longer soft but made of straw, your room no longer private, but a dormitory shared with a dozen other souls. Your daily schedule no longer yours to decide but dictated by a rule written centuries ago, rigid, unchanging, absolute. This is the world of the medieval monastery, a place that may seem peaceful in memory or romanticized in popular imagination, but which, in reality, was a world of sacrifice, of isolation, of ritualized hardship disguised as spiritual purity. It is a place where every aspect of life was subsumed into a greater whole, where the self was slowly shaved away like the hair on a monk's tonsured head, leaving only obedience, routine, and the dull ache of fading individuality. And yet people chose this life, or were chosen for it, not out of sadism, but out of a deeply embedded cultural and spiritual logic, one that told them this life of hardship was not meaningless, but wholly not crushing but purifying. And so, tonight as you listen, you will walk not through grand battles or fiery revolutions, but through cloisters and candlelit scriptoria, herb gardens, and icy chapels, where the only sound may be the rustle of a robe or the scrape of sandals on cold stone. In this story, we do not chase excitement. We follow the flow of time as it passed for those whose names we do not know, whose voices were rarely heard, and whose lives were shaped by quiet endurance. This will be a slow journey, one meant not to rouse the mind, but to lull it gently into a state of restful curiosity. We begin by stepping into the daily life of a monk, a man who rises in darkness, eats in silence, works without complaint, and prays with aching knees on a floor that never warms beneath him. We will see what it was like to live entirely by the bell, to scrub stone with frozen fingers, to chant in a language and to sleep beside men who may never speak to you, not out of cruelty but out of devotion. Next, we will turn to the story of Jan Hus, a man whose quiet defiance became too loud for the church to ignore, whose ideas sown in sermons and letters grew into flames that would consume him at the stake and echo long after his death. We will follow the slow unraveling of safety, the creeping arrival of danger, the bureaucracy of heresy, and the machinery of punishment, all moved by doctrine, pride, and politics. Then we'll pivot into mystery, not of violence or conspiracy, but of pages covered in looping script no one can read. Pages filled with plants that do not grow on earth, strange women bathing in pools, zodiac signs twisted into new forms. This is the Voynich manuscript, and we will leaf through it slowly, exploring the guesses, the dead ends, and the soft allure of an unsolved puzzle that resists resolution but invites wonder. Finally, we will step into a different chamber of the ecclesiastical world, not the cold cell of a novice monk, but the banquet hall of a bishop. Their robes are embroidered, wine flows freely, and the words of Christ sit alongside silver cutlery and feathered beds. We will examine how vows of poverty coexist with wealth, how humility can be worn like a performance, and how power is maintained not through violence, but through pageantry, titles, and ceremonial routine. But first, let us return to the beginning, not the theological beginning, nor the historical one, but the experiential one. Let us begin with the sound of a bell, tolling in the dark, somewhere around 2 o'clock in the morning. The room is cold, the air is thick with breath, with silence, with the faint scent of wool and old stone. A novice, newly arrived, opens his eyes. He will not speak today. He may not speak tomorrow. He will pray, eat, labor, and sleep, each act dictated by the bell and by the ancient rhythm of his community. He is not free, but he is not lost. He is part of something older than himself, larger than himself, something that demands everything but promises salvation. And so he rises, and so he walks, and so he kneels. As you listen tonight, let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of these quiet lives. Let your thoughts stretch out into the cloister, into the garden, into the scriptorium, and let the hum of history carry you gently toward sleep. There will be no loud voices here, no sharp turns, just steady steps through the forgotten corridors of a time long past, a time where stillness was sacred, and every moment was shaped by duty, by discipline, and by the soft tolling of a bell that no longer rings, but still echoes. Let us begin. Imagine, now, that you are not yet a monk, but standing on the threshold of becoming one. You are young, perhaps 17, perhaps younger, and the world you know is small, shaped by the slow seasons of the land, the steady work of your family, and the customs of your village. If you are the son of a noble, you are not the eldest. Your older brother will inherit the land, the titles, the responsibilities. Your place, though still honored, is secondary, and a life within the church offers stability, learning, and, perhaps, quiet influence. If you are the child of a peasant, the reasons are different too. Your family may have little to give, but hope and a single opportunity to lift one member into the security of a monastery may be worth every sacrifice. In other cases, perhaps more common than we like to imagine, the decision was not yours at all. You may have been offered to the monastery as an act of gratitude or obligation, or simply because there were too many mouths to feed. A gifted child may have caught the attention of a village priest, who saw promise in your memory, your letters, your stillness, or you may have simply had nowhere else to go. The monastery promises a roof, a rhythm, a place. It promises meaning. And so you find yourself here, on this day, just before dawn, at the gates of a life that will be your only life from now on. The wind carries the scent of wet grass and stone, and your feet still bear touch the dewy ground outside the chapter house. A monk, no grand crowds, if your family has come to watch, they stand apart, heads bowed. If you have come alone, it is even quieter. The ceremony is not dramatic. It is solemn, structured, ancient. First comes the shavender. You kneel, still in your old clothes, and a monk takes shears to your hair. The crown is shaved bare, a circle of vulnerability left exposed to the cold air, a mark that you are no longer your own. The hair falls silently to the floor, swept away quickly, without sentiment. Next comes the robe, a simple garment of undyed wool, coarse against your skin. As it is draped over your shoulders, the robe does not feel like clothing. It feels like a wall going up around you. It conceals you, it protects you, and it separates you from the person you were. A belt of rope is tied at the waist. Sandals are placed at your feet. And then, the vows. They are not spoken loudly. They are not shouted. They are murmured, in Latin, words you have practiced for days, maybe weeks, maybe longer. You speak of obedience, of stability, of conversion of life. These are not symbolic. These are literal. You are vowing to stay here, in this monastery, until death. You are vowing to do as your superior commands. You are vowing to abandon the life you had before your family, your ambitions, your name. You will not marry. You will not own anything. You will not decide when to eat, when to sleep, or when to speak. And yet, in this moment, there is also something else, a quiet current of hope, or perhaps release. The world outside is uncertain. There are wars, famines, taxes, accidents. There is hunger. Here, in this cloister, there is predictability. There is order. You will never be rich, but you will never starve. You will never be famous, but you will never be alone. The vow of obedience is also a shedding of burden. No more decisions. No more striving. You are a cell in a body. You are one candle among many. As the ceremony ends, a name is spoken, your name, and for a moment, it feels strange to hear it. It echoes in the stone hall, and you realize that this may be the last time it is ever spoken aloud in this way. From now on, you will be Brother Thomas, or Brother Peter, or Brother Matthew. Your family name will not be used. Your past will not be discussed. You rise. You do not embrace your parents if they are present. You do not weep. The ritual does not allow for sentiment. You are led to your cell, a small room with a cot, a basin, and a wooden crucifix. It is not your own, but it is where you will sleep. There is no mirror. You will not see yourself often. And over time, you may forget what your face once looked like, before the robe. That night, you eat with the brothers. A simple meal, bread, broth, perhaps a little cheese. No one speaks. A monk reads from a holy text while the others chew in silence. You are watched not harshly, but carefully. Your posture, your movements, your discipline. This is not cruelty. This is tradition. You are being folded into a living system, one that has functioned for generations. After the meal, you return to your cell. You kneel. You pray. You do not pray for release. You pray to understand. You pray to surrender. As you lie on the cot, the stone wall cool behind your head, you hear the wind through the slits in the wall, the occasional shuffle of sandals down the corridor, and the faint creak of beams overhead. You sleep. And when the bell rings, in the dark, hours before dawn, you rise not as a boy, not as a son, but as a monk in training. And so it begins. The rhythm of their lives began not with the sunrise, but with the sound of a bell in the deep of Nittala, measured tolling that drifted through the cold corridors like a call not of urgency but of inevitability. It was matins, the first of the canonical hours, and it arrived around 2 o'clock in the morning, long before even the earliest stirrings of the world outside the monastery walls. The bell did not demand, it reminded. You would awaken not with a start, but with the steady ache of habit. The stone floor was cold beneath your feet as you rose, dressing in silence, your robe rough against your skin. Others stirred around you in the dormitory, the soft rustle of wool, the muted sound of feet slipping into sandals. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The monastery had no need of words before dawn. You joined your brothers in the procession down the corridor. The only light, a single candle passed between hands. The footsteps echoed faintly, a steady pattern against worn flagstones, and overhead, the beams of the vaulted ceiling seemed to hum with the memory of generations who had walked this path before. The chapel was dim, the air inside cooler than even the hallways, thick with incense and old breath, and you knelt not because you wished to, but because the rule said so. Matins was not brief, it stretched for nearly an hour, filled with chanting, psalms, readings in Latin whose full meaning you might not grasp, but whose cadence shaped your mind like the sea shapes the shore. The sound was not music, not exactly, it was rhythm, it was memory, it was submission in sonic form. After matins, there was a short return to rest, but not sleep. You lay again on your cot, eyes open in the darkness, listening to the silence between the tolls. At first light, the bell rang again, lords. Another prayer, another hour, the chapel again, the same worn pages, the same postures, the same words. The rhythm of their lives depended not on novelty, but on repetition. After lauds came prime, the first true hour of daylight prayers, and with it, the shift from spiritual to physical labor. The monks dispersed across the monastery, each to his assigned task, which rarely changed and was never questioned. You might be sent to the gardens, where herbs grew in tidy row sage, thyme, lavender, yarrow, each tended not for pleasure but for utility. The soil was cold in the early morning, damp and clinging to the fingers. You worked without gloves. The scent of the earth mixed with that of the crushed herbs, fragrant but never indulgent. Birds might sing faintly in the trees beyond the walls, but you did not pause to listen. The rhythm did not allow for it. Elsewhere, another monk fed the animals, chickens clucking softly, goats bleating in the still air. In the kitchen, vegetables were chopped, bread was kneaded, all without conversation. The knife on the board, the stirring of the pot, the creak of the wooden table, these were the sounds that filled the day. In the scriptorium, where you might be assigned if your hands were steady and your Latin sufficient, the world narrowed to parchment, ink, and silence. You sat on a hard bench, hunched forward, quill in hand, copying texts with slow precision. The ink smelled faintly of gall and vinegar, and each page had weight, not just physically, but spiritually. You were preserving the word of God or the commentary of some long-dead theologian letter by letter. Mistakes were not punished harshly, but they were mourned, as one mourns a note out of tune in a choir that must never falter. And always, the silence. At terse, mid-morning, the bell rang again, and you returned to the chapel. The same chant, the same readings. Then back to work. At sext, around noon, another bell, another prayer. Lunch followed, if it could be called lunch. A simple meal in the refectory. Lentils, perhaps, or barley soup, bread that was more crust than crumb, water or weak ale. You ate in silence as one monk stood at the lectern and read aloud from scripture or from the life of a saint, words meant not to entertain, but to edify, to remind you that even in eating, you are not your own. After the meal, you wiped your bowl clean with a piece of bread, then folded your hands and waited. Back to work. At none, mid-afternoon, another toll, another prayer. Then the final stretch of labor, perhaps tending the sick in the infirmary, or cleaning the latrines, or mending the robes in the sewing room. Your needle passing through thick fabric as the light from the high windows shifted slowly across the floor. At vespers, just before sunset, the chapel filled again with chanting voices, the shadows long and golden, the air cooler. You felt your knees ache as you knelt once more. The words came automatically. You did not think them. You became them. Supper was no different from lunch, though often thinner, simpler, more penitential. There might be fruit, in season, There might be cheese, if the animals had given enough. No meat, rarely eggs. The monk read again as you ate, and again, you listened without reacting. And again, the silence. The rhythm of their lives did not include laughter, or idle conversation, or even questions. At Complan, the final hour of prayer, the chapel was lit with more candles, their flames softening the stone, casting gentle halos around the heads of saints carved into the walls. You sang again, or listened, your voice blending with those around you, until it was no longer yours. Then came the great silence. No words were to be spoken from Complan until after prime the next day. You walked the corridors without comment, bowed your head in passing, returned to your cell. You lay down on your cot, hands folded over your chest, the cold again seeping up from the floor. Your eyes closed, your breath slowed, and just before you drifted into sleep, you knew deep in your bones, in the marrow of your disciplined soul, that the bell would ring again. Another prayer, another hour, another day in the rhythm that would stretch not for weeks or months, but for decades. You would rise, you would chant, you would labor, you would sleep, then rise again. The rhythm of their lives was not shaped by desire or achievement, but by obedience. And always, the silence. The life of a medieval monk was not merely shaped by routine, it was governed by a deeply structured code. A set of guidelines handed down over centuries that dictated not only what a monk did, but how he thought, how he moved, how he existed within his cloistered world. This code, known as the Rule of Saint Benedict, was composed in the 6th century and became the cornerstone of monastic life across Western Europe. It was not a rule in the modern sense of laws backed by enforcement and punishment, but a spiritual framework, comprehensive, disciplined, and quietly absolute. At its core were 3 vows that every monk would take, sometimes repeatedly throughout his life: obedience, stability, and conversion of life, which included poverty and chastity as central expressions. Obedience was not merely following orders, it was the surrender of will. A monk did not ask why he was told to scrub the cloister floor again, or why he was assigned to the garden instead of the scriptorium. He did not negotiate, he bowed his head. Stability meant remaining in one monastery, one spiritual home, for life. The rule discouraged movement, discouraged restlessness, discouraged ambition. And conversion of life, the most abstract and yet the most pervasive, meant allowing oneself to be remade through the rule itself, to become not an individual, but a vessel of humility, simplicity, and devotion. In practice, this way of life was strict, but not cruel. It was controlled, but not chaotic. Silence was central, not merely as an absence of noise, but as a spiritual posture. Monks spoke only when necessary, and then only briefly. The rule encouraged restraint in word and thought alike. It was believed that through silence, a monk could listen not only to scripture or superiors, but to God himself. And when a rule was broken, as it inevitably was from time to time, the response was not rage, nor physical punishment, but correction, quiet, public, and meant to reintegrate the monk into the harmony of the community. Take, for example, the simple act of falling asleep during vigils, the early morning prayer. Perhaps the brother had worked too hard the day before in the fields. Perhaps he was ill, or simply young, but the rule required alertness. It required presence. If his head began to droop or his voice fell silent in the chanting, the prior might tap his shoulder not harshly but firmly, and motion for him to stand in the back of the chapel for the remainder of the service, a gentle but visible reminder that prayer was a duty that transcended fatigue. No word would be spoken, but the message would be clear. Afterward, he might be assigned an extra reading, or asked to fast from Sapunad as punishment. Another example, imagine a young monk, perhaps not long in the habit, sharing a whispered joke in the cloister with a fellow brother as they scrubbed the floor or passed through the scriptorium. The joke itself might not be offensive, perhaps. It was even clever, but the act of whispering, of bringing levity where solemnity was expected, would be seen as a disruption. If caught, the monk would not be lashed, nor locked away, but he might be required to recite a psalm in front of the assembled brothers at dinner, or to sit alone at meals for a week away from the communal table, as a reminder that unity required discipline. Sometimes, penance took the form of additional prayers, long hours spent kneeling on stone, reciting the psalms in sequence, not aloud, but silently, lips barely moving, fingers tracing the beads of a simple rosary. Other times, the consequence was a cold meal, served separately, without the warmth of companionship or the dignity of the daily reading. These corrections were never framed as punishments, but as medicine for the soul, treatment for the creeping illness of pride or distraction. The monastery saw itself as a hospital, and St. Evan's small sins like inattentiveness or laughter as wounds that needed dressing. The rule of St. Benedict prescribed that no one was above reproach, not even the abbot himself. If he was unjust, the brothers could appeal to the rule, though always with humility, always through the proper channels. Pride was the most dangerous of all temptations. A monk who excelled in copying manuscripts might be gently rotated into manual labor, lest he begin to feel superior to those who weeded the garden. A monk whose voice led the chants might be asked to sweep the chapel steps, to remind him that no gift outweighed obedience. And so, the structure held not through violence, but through a shared commitment to order, a trust in the rule, and the quiet pressure of communal example. There were, of course, greater transgressions, moments of real conflict, of resistance or scandal, but these were rare, and rarely spoken of. Most discipline was small, repetitive, and as gentle as it was firm, and always it occurred within the bounds of the day's rhythm. A monk might err at terce, reflect on it at sext, and receive correction at none. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was forgotten. The rhythm of their lives made space for both failure and redemption. And always, the silence. It was in the silence that guilt softened, that resolve returned, that humility was rebuilt, like the walls of the monastery itself, stone by stone, word by word, until the self dissolved again into the rule. And yet even within the long corridors of silence, within the strictness of bells and rules, not every moment in the monastery was cold or joyless or without grace. There were moments rare and unannounced when something softer moved through the cloister, a breeze of unexpected beauty, a stillness so complete. It felt like a gift, not an obligation. These moments did not break the rhythm of monastic life, they arose from it, like a wildflower sprouting from a stone path, unnoticed at first, then quietly impossible to ignore. Imagine standing in the cloister garden just before sunset, your hands still dusted with soil from the herb beds. Time all grown not for ornament but for medicine, for salve, for the calming of baddies, worn thin by cold stone and long prayers. The garden is walled, simple, square. A fig tree leans gently in one corner, its roots older than you. The path is worn with sandals, and in that hour between none and then, when the sun hangs low and golden above the horizon, the light touches the leaves with a softness not found anywhere else in your day. The wind, when it comes, carries not command, but memory, the distant smell of the cook fires, the faintest sound of someone sweeping the walkways, the quiet rustle of linen habits as brothers pass without speaking. You pause, hands folded behind your back, eyes lifted not toward scripture or ritual, but toward the sky, and in the middle of it, all the silence. The cold sometimes a hawk circled above the garden, and you watched. You did not smile, but your gaze followed the wings as they cut slow arcs through the dusk, as though the bird knew something of freedom that you had forgotten, or never known. In the scriptorium, too, there were quiet the act of copying texts, while repetitive and demanding, offered a kind of meditative focus. The world narrowed to ink and line, to the sound of the quill scratching gently against the surface of parchment, to the slow flow of thought made visible. Your breath slowed, your posture straightened. Occasionally you were allowed to illuminate a little. Single capital drawn in color gilded, perhaps if the monastery had the materials, and for that moment, you were not merely a transcriber of words, but a kind of artist hidden, anonymous, but still present in the curve of the stroke, in the red ink that bloomed like a rose at the margin of the page. These details were not for vanity. No one would know which letter you had adorned, but in your heart, a small warmth lingered, a moment of expression inside a life of obedience. The chapel, during certain hours, could feel almost like another world entirely. After Vespers, when the day's labor was done, when the bells slowed their call and the air cooled, the chants carried more gently, more slowly. The acoustics of stone and vaulted ceilings turned each voice into something larger than itself, not loud, not bright, but resonant, as though the chapel itself remembered every chant ever sung within its walls, and sang them back in a voice made of echoes and shadows. The candles glowed softly, their flames small but steady, illuminating dust that drifted lazily through the beams of fading sunlight. The scent of incense clung to the wood and the stone, familiar now, comforting in its way, a signal to the body that night was near, that rest would come. You knelt, not in agony but in rhythm, your knees long since numbed to the hardness of the floor, your mind quiet, not empty but still. In that space, the harshness of the day melted. You did not think of yourself. You did not remember what you had done wrong. You did not plan what tomorrow would hold. You simply existed, one small voice in a sea of harmony, one breath in a building made to contain thousands of breaths before yours and thousands after. The apothecary, hidden near the back of the cloister, was another sanctuary. Shelves lined with dried bundles of plants, jars of crushed petals, twine-wrapped sachets of roots and bark. It smelled not of sterility, but of earth and intention. A monk there might crush lavender to make a poultice, or steep chamomile for an aching stomach, and you, passing through or assigned for the day, might pause for a moment to inhale deeply, to feel the world become not a place of rules and stone, but of life, 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 life. No voices echoed in the apothecary. The mortar and pestle spoke instead, and the scent of mint, of sage, of marigold reminded you that healing existed, even in this place of ascent. And sometimes, just sometimes, the world outside crept in, gently ran, tapping on high windows. Snow falling so silently you only noticed because the world was brighter with its reflection. A bird nesting in the eaves of the cloister walk. You were not supposed to notice these things. Not exactly, but neither were you forbidden. They were part of God's creation, after all, and their beauty did not interrupt devotion, they framed it. Even in the refectory, where meals were taken in silence, where the readings were often dry or difficult, there were subtle comforts. The feel of warm broth on a cold day, the shared lifting of spoons, perfectly timed, an unspoken choreography of community. The sound of the reader's voice steady and familiar, rising and falling in the same cadence each day, until it became less about the meaning of the words and more about the sound itself, a kind of lullaby made of doctrine. These were not joys in the usual sense. They were not pleasures, as the world outside might define them, but they were enough. They were threads of solace woven into the fabric of obedience. They gave color to the gray, and in these moments, brief, unspoken, often unnoticed, the monastic life revealed something deeper. Not merely suffering, but not merely repetition, but devotion. Not merely silence, but peace. A peace that came not from comfort, but from surrender. A peace that, like the hawk circling above the cloister, belonged to no one and yet was visible to all who paused long enough to see it. And so you moved through the days not for reward, not for glory, but because the rhythm of their lives was its own kind of prayer. And always, the silence. Time in the monastery does not rush it, does not lurch forward with sudden change, nor does it offer the milestones by which people outside might measure a life. No weddings, no children, no career advancements, no houses bought or sold, no birthdays celebrated with noise and laughter. Instead, it flows like a slow stream, carving deep grooves through the days, through the years, through the self. And over time, gently, steadily, with no ceremony or sudden moment of realization, your identity begins to dissolve, not violently, not tragically, but inevitably. You do not notice it at first. In your first year, you still remember the feel of your childhood bed, the sound of your mother's voice, the name you were called before you took your vows. But as years pass, those memories fade, not because they are torn from you, but because they are no longer needed. The rule does not speak of you as an individual. It speaks of the brotherhood, the body, the community. You are a hand, a breath, a voice in the chant. Your opinions do not matter. Your preferences are not sought. The robe you wear is indistinguishable from that of the brother beside you, and the tasks you perform, be they cooking, copying, cleaning, or caring for the ill, are assigned, without regard for desire. Even the tone of your voice blends into the others during prayer. No one listens for you. No one remarks on your inflection. The uniqueness of your footsteps, the angle of your handwriting, the shape of your shoulders, these details are not erased, but they are absorbed, slowly, until you become not an individual among brothers, but a brother among individuals. The years turn over like the pages of a psalter. Winter becomes spring, Lent becomes Easter, Advent becomes Christmas. The bells toll, the prayers continue. Your body begins to feel the passage of time in ways the rule never mentions explicitly. Knees that stiffen in the morning, fingers that no longer thread a needle with ease. Eyes that struggle to follow the small letters of Latin texts by candlelight. The work remains the same, but you do it more slowly now. You rise from your cot with a faint ache in your hips. You walk with care on the slick stones when the rain soaks the cloister walk. No one comments. No one pities. Age is accepted as rain is accepted, as wear and tear on the building itself is accepted. It is simply part of the rhythm. You notice perhaps with a flicker of thought, that some of the younger monks now call you brother with a different tone, so deferential, as though they sense your place in the arc of life is slowly shifting. And then, one day, the cot of a brother near you is empty. He does not rise from that. The infirmarian had visited him more often in recent weeks. His chant had been quieter, and now, he is gone. The monastery does not weep. It prepares. His robe is removed and folded, his possessions few as they are. A small wooden cross, perhaps a pair of worn sandals are gathered. He is washed, not for vanity, but for dignity. He is laid out in the chapel, and for a short time, the chant shifts. Prayers for the dead are offered, psalms of remembrance, but there is no wailing, no grand eulogy. His name is spoken once, perhaps twice, then folded away into the records. The grave is dug in the monastery cemetery, a short walk beyond the cloister walls. You attend, walking in silence with the other brothers. The sky is overcast. A slight breeze rustles the edges of your robe. The dirt is dark and damp. There is no stone, no monument, perhaps a wooden marker, perhaps not. And then the bell tolls again, and you return to your duties. The kitchen must be cleaned. The pages must be the floor must be swept. You do not grieve loudly. The rule does not allow for it, and in truth, you no longer feel the urge. Death in the monastery is not a disruption, it is a continuation, and you begin to feel it, not with fear, but with recognition. Someday, your cot will be empty. Someday, your name will be read aloud once, perhaps twice, and then not again. And this does not frighten you. It soothes you. The longer you live within the walls, the more you understand that anonymity is not a loss, it is a form of peace. There is no one to impress. There is no legacy to guard. Your life is not yours, and therefore its end does not belong to you either. You have lived according to the rhythm. You have folded yourself into the pattern, and even as your knees grow weaker, as your eyes dim, as your voice trembles on the final lines of Compline, you are not anxious. You are tired, yes, but it is the fatigue of completion, not defeat. You begin to walk more slowly. You are given fewer physical tasks, more time for prayer, and as the days pass, one after another, identical and unique, you feel yourself becoming something simpler than a name or a memory. You become presence. You become posture. You become part of the stone, the wood, the chant. The others still see you, but they do not expect novelty from you. They do not seek wisdom, not in words. Your wisdom is in your quiet, in your repetition, in the way you move through the cloister with calm inevitability. You are not alone, but you are no longer distinct. And so you fade not into despair, but into the rhythm itself. Long before the flames, long before the councils, the trials, the verdicts, and the voices of history weighed his name with meaning, Jan Hus was simply a boy from a quiet town Husinec, nestled in the soft, green hills of southern Bohemia, a place where the rhythm of the seasons mattered more than politics, and the rising of the sun over the thatched rooftops marked time far more faithfully than any clock. The town was modest, with little to distinguish it from dozens of others that dotted the Czech countryside. Stone homes, wooden carts, church bells that rang on Sundays and feast days, narrow footpaths that turned to mud in the spring. His family was not rich likely peasants, or minor townsfolk at best, but there was, in the young boy named Jan, a quiet aptitude that did not shout, but simply emerged. He learned quickly, he listened, he remembered. And in a world where education was a rare and precious gift, his abilities did not go unnoticed. There were few books, few teachers, but the local clergy may have seen in him the rare potential to read the Latin texts, to parse the sacred mysteries, to serve the church not merely through devotion, but through learning. And so like a river quietly redirected, Jan Hus was sent away from Husinec, prog toward something larger, toward the stone walls and vaulted classrooms of Charles University, a place that had already begun to shape the intellectual life of Bohemia and beyond. Prague in the late 14th century was not the bustling, imperial city it would later become, but it was already growing, already humming with the layered conversations of merchants, clerics, craftsmen, and students. The streets, uneven and crowded, twisted through neighborhoods that smelled of firewood and wet limestone, of ink and parchment and damp wool. Charles University had been founded only a few decades earlier, in 1348, but it had already become a beacon of learning, drawing students, not only from the Czech lands, but from Germany, Poland, Hungary, and beyond. The language of instruction was Latin in lectures, Latin in debate, Latin in scripture. For a boy from Husinek, the shift from Czech to Latin was no small transition. It was not just a language, it was an entire worldview. To learn it was to step out of the rhythms of one's childhood and into the strict cadences of scholastic reasoning, of theological categories, of canonical law. Hus did not resist this. He adapted quickly and quietly. He walked among old stone buildings, where the echo of Latin words drifted like incense through the halls, where the air smelled faintly of candle wax, chalk dust, and the dry muss of borrowed books. There was no campus as we know it. Today classes were held in churches, in borrowed halls, wherever space allowed. A typical day for a theology student began before sunrise. He would rise from a hard wooden bench or straw pallet in a shared dormitory and walk through the city's narrow lanes to a lecture, clutching a wax tablet or perhaps a thin sheaf of parchment. The lecture might be on Aristotle's logic, or Peter Lombard's sentences, or the writings of Augustine. The professor would speak slowly, carefully, pausing for questions, but only the boldest students interrupted. Hus was not bold, not yet. He was observant. He took notes. He reflected. After the lecture came disputation. Students would debate each other, often in Latin, refining their thinking through respectful disagreement. Then came Mass, often several times a day, followed by more study, copying texts by hand, practicing penmanship, translating scripture from Latin to Czech for private reflection. Meals were sparse bread, beans, weak beer, and conversation was limited to academic discussion. The intellectual world of Charles University was structured but not closed. Ideas moved slowly through manuscript and rumor, and in this environment, Hus encountered the early tremors of reform. He heard of John Wycliffe, the English scholar whose writings questioned the Church's authority, who suggested that Scripture should have primacy over tradition, that the Church should reflect the poverty of Christ rather than the wealth of princes. But at this stage, Hus did not adopt such ideas blindly. He remained within the bounds of orthodoxy. He respected the hierarchy of the Church, the gravity of the sacraments, the necessity of order. He was not a radical, yet he was a student, trying to understand the balance between truth and obedience. He saw contradictions, bishops who lived in luxury, priests who spoke in Latin to congregations who understood only Czech, but these were observations, not yet convictions. His days passed in study and quiet service. He became a tutor, then a lecturer himself. His Latin grew fluent, but he did not forget his Czech. He began to preach not grand sermons, not political declarations, but gentle invitations to consider the meaning of Christ's words, the purpose of humility, the danger of pride. The Church allowed it, even encouraged it. Hus was promising, articulate, dedicated. He moved upward first academically, then spiritually. He became dean of the Faculty of Philosophy, then rector of the university itself, an honor earned not through ambition, but through steadiness, through a quiet confidence that others began to trust. Through these early years, Hus remained within the structure of the Church, seeking not to tear it down, but to serve it more faithfully. He did not burn with fury, he glowed with focus. He believed that truth could be found within the walls he inhabited, that the Church, if gently reminded, could return to its roots. He was a man shaped by his time but already slightly out of step with each student who became a teacher, a thinker who would become a preacher, and eventually, a preacher who would be forced to choose between safety and conscience. But in these years, these quiet years, he was simply Jan Hus of Bohemia, walking carefully through the winding alleys of Prague, carrying books under his arm, eyes cast downward in thought. Speak might cost him his life. It is easy centuries later to imagine Jan Hus as a provocateur, a challenger of norms, a defiant voice against corruption. But this is to misunderstand the nature of his rise. For Hus was never a firebrand, never a man who sought conflict for its own sake, and in his early years, as a preacher, his influence grew not because he was loud, but because he was consistent, careful, and clear. His pulpit was the Bethlehem chapel, not a cathedral of gilded arches and jeweled relics. Preaching house in the heart of Prague, funded by local benefactors who wished the word of God to be spoken in Czech, a radical notion at the time though wrapped in the soft garb of pastoral concern. In that hall, capable of holding as many as 3,000 souls, Hus stepped forward not with fury but with fluency. He spoke Czech fluently and lovingly, weaving the words of Scripture into the familiar rhythm of his listeners' daily lives. When he read the Beat, for they shall inherit the earth, he did not leave the words floating in Latin, like incense above the heads of the congregation. He brought them down, translated them, explained them, slowly, and without flourish, so that the carpenter at the back of the hall, the widow with a kerchief tied against the cold, the child watching flies circle a window so that all of them could hear not just the words, but the meaning. This was not dramatic. It was not a performance. It was an act of pastoral care. And yet, in doing it, Hus quietly shifted the gravitational center of the religious experience in Prague. No longer was the priest merely an interpreter of the mystery, he became a servant of the people's understanding, and this, more than any polemic, unsettled the hierarchy. Hus was a university man, trained in scholastic method, fluent in Aristotle and Aquinas, versed in canon law. He could have used his intellect to climb, become a bishop, write commentaries, ascend through administration, but instead he chose the pulpit, and from there he chose to speak plainly. In his sermons, he emphasized moral clarity, not theological rebellion, but a return to ethical seriousness. He questioned the lifestyles of some clergy, not with venom, but with scriptural example. If Christ lived simply, why did bishops ride in carriages? If Jesus taught openly and in the tongue of the people, why did priests mutter in Latin to congregants who did not understand? His sermons were marked not by condemnation, but by contrast. He did not need to say the church was corrupt, he simply described the humility of Christ, and the people filled in the rest. At first, the church tolerated this. Reform-minded bishops existed. After all, moral exhortation was expected from the pulpit. But Hus's popularity grew, and his consistency did not waver. He preached. They listened. He preached again. His sermons were copied by hand, passed around, read aloud in taverns and parlors. The people began to ask quiet questions, and as his voice became more trusted among the laity, it became more suspect among the clergy. His ties to John Wycliffe deepened this suspicion, not because he blindly repeated Wycliffe's ideas, but because he engaged with them thoughtfully, publicly, and without apology. Wycliffe, dead for decades, had argued that Scripture must stand above papal authority, church should renounce wealth, that indulgences were fraudulent, and that the Eucharist, so central to Catholic theology, did not literally become the body of Christ. Hus did not echo all of this. In fact, he remained traditional in his view of the sacraments, and he was more measured in tone, but he agreed that reform was needed, that clerical abuse was real, and that truth must be obeyed, even when it is inconvenient to those in power. Hus believed that a priest must live what he preached, and if he failed to do so, his authority was weakened. The line he walked was narrow enough to draw crowds, not enough to draw charges, but the church watched. Reports were sent. His words were quoted out of context. Letters arrived from abroad. Papal bulls denouncing Wycliffe's teachings began to circulate in Prague. The Archbishop of Prague, once hesitant, now acted, ordering the confiscation and burning of certain heretical texts. 300 volumes were destroyed. Hus protested not violently, but in writing, calmly, with citations, arguing that truth should not fear the scrutiny of inquiry. He preached. They listened, and he was warned. Again he replied with a sermon, another homily. He did not accuse the Pope directly, but he asked whether indulgences sold for coin, traded like goods, could truly reflect divine mercy. Was the forgiveness of sins something to be priced? He asked questions that others had whispered in private, and he asked them in public. He remained still within the church. He took Mass. He honored the saints, but, increasingly, he spoke with an independence that sounded, to some ears, like sedition, and the more he was cautioned, the more calmly he returned to his pulpit. He did not call for revolution. He called for examination. He did not condemn the clergy. He simply asked them to live more like the gospel they proclaimed. And yet, this quiet insistence became harder to ignore. The Bethlehem chapel grew crowded, even as other priests criticized his tone. The university was divided. The archbishop distanced himself. Rome took note. Hus was summoned to explain himself, but he declined the first invitation, concerned, perhaps, that a fair hearing was unlikely. He was excommunicated. He appealed. The sentence was reaffirmed. A second, more aggressive excommunication followed. The church imposed an interdict on Prague itself, a spiritual embargo. No sacraments could be performed in the city until Hus was removed. Weddings were postponed. Burials went unblessed. Baptisms were delayed. The people, at first, supported him, but the pressure grew. Hus did not resist. He left Prague voluntarily. He retreated to the countryside, to write, to pray, to consider what came next. But the rhythm of his sermons lingered in the city, the clear tone, the slow pace, the gentle conviction. He had not shouted, but he had been heard. He had not rebelled, but he had disturbed. And so the church moved more deliberately. The invitation to the Council of Constance would come next. It would be presented as an opportunity to speak freely, to defend himself, to resolve the conflict through dialogue. But the tone of those letters was formal, cold, burdened with the weight of political necessity. They did not seek peace, they sought closure, and yet Hus, faithful still, would go not in defiance, but in hope, for he still believed in the church. He still believed reform could be peaceable. He still believed truth could be spoken in a steady voice, and that the men who governed Christ's church would eventually recognize it. But the walls were already closing. The council was already convening, and the bells that once called people to listen now began to ring for something else entirely. There comes a point in the life of every man who dares to speak with conviction, when the voice that once drew listeners begins to draw consequences instead. And for Jan Hus, the shift was neither immediate nor dramatic, but like the slow dimming of a lantern whose oil is being deliberately withheld, not extinguished in one gust, but starved hour by hour, until its light flickers in corners rather than fills the chapel as it once had. His first excommunication arrived not with shouts or guards at his door, but as a document, dry, official, signed and sealed, bearing not the fury of a persecutor, but the indifference of a system preserving itself. He had continued to preach. He had continued to speak Czech. He had questioned indulgences. He had refused to denounce John Wycliffe entirely. For this, he was declared excommunicate, his rights to the sacraments revoked, his presence in holy functions forbidden. But Hus did not yield. He replied not with rebellion, but with letters, patient, precise, grounded in scripture and canon law. He believed, still, that misunderstanding could be corrected, that reasoned defense would be heard. He remained in Prague, continued his duties at Bethlehem Chapel, and found that the people still came. He was not yet an outcast. But then came the interdict, a heavier blow, not aimed at him directly, but at the city that harbored him, issued by the Archbishop of Prague and supported from Rome. The interdict declared that as long as Hus remained in the city, no priest could offer the Mass, no confessions could be heard, no burials could be blessed. The sacraments, the heartbeat of spiritual life, were silenced. For the devout, this was not an inconvenience, but a spiritual famine. Weddings were postponed. Funerals passed without ritual. Baptisms, once a source of community joy, were held in secret or delayed indefinitely. The people grew restless. Some grumbled against Hus, others blamed the church, many simply suffered in silence. Hus had not asked for this. He had not incited, but he could see the pain unfolding around him, and so, in an act that defined the quiet dignity of his character, he chose not to fight for his place, but to relinquish it. He left the city. There was no procession, no dramatic farewell. He slipped away from Prague quietly, sometime in 1412, and made his way into the hills and fields of southern Bohemia, into exile, not of punishment, but of conscience. He did not flee. He withdrew, and in that act, he preserved not only the peace of the city, but the clarity of his own voice. The world he entered was not the world of manuscripts and disputations, of public debate and cathedral echo. It was a rural world, made of stone cottages, silent power, wind that whispered through tall grass and pine, and sky that stretched without interruption. Here Hus found himself again, not in argument, but in contemplation. The cities argued, but in the hills there was only wind, and the scratch of ink on parchment. He stayed in castles and villages, often hosted by sympathetic nobles who admired his integrity, if not always his theology. He rose early as he always had, and he prayed. Not in grand chapels, but in small oratories, or sometimes in open fields, where birdsong replaced chant, and where the psalms spoken aloud to trees and wind seemed to fall into a silence deeper than any cathedral. Without the pulpit, he wrote. His pen became his new voice. He composed treatises, letters, theological reflections, always seeking not to inflame, but to persuade. His tone remained calm, measured, grounded. He wrote of the church as a body, wounded but still holy, in need of healing, not He questioned indulgences, not because he hated Rome, but because he loved truth. He critiqued corrupt clergy, not because he desired chaos, but because he saw how their example distorted the image of Christ for the people. Alone in the countryside, he read the Gospels over and over, lingered on passages of Christ's humility, his poverty, his suffering, He saw in the life of Christ not a metaphor, but a model. He asked himself whether a church so distant from this example could still lead souls faithfully. His doubts were not angry. They were quiet, persistent, like a brook cutting stone. He still hoped for reform. He still believed the church could turn inward and remember itself. But he also began to suspect that the forces arrayed against that memory were more deeply rooted than he had imagined. In solitude, he was not idle. He corresponded with supporters, students, fellow clerics. He answered their questions, consoled their doubts. Many urged him to recant, to preserve his life, to return to conformity for the sake of peace. Others pushed him toward more aggressive stances, more definitive rejections. Hus did neither. He held the middle ground, not because it was safest, but because it was, for him, the only honest place to stand. He believed that the word of God must guide the church, not the ambitions of popes, nor the wealth of prelates. But he also believed in order, in unity, in tradition. His thoughts, like his steps through the quiet forests, followed a narrow path. And as months passed, his name continued to spread. No longer just a preacher in Prague. His exile had not silenced him. It had, in a way, amplified him. Those who supported reform quoted him. Those who feared unrest denounced him. He became a symbol, even as he sat in silence, pen in hand, beside a window that looked out over mist-covered hills. There, he watched the changing seasons, the slow yellowing of leaves, the early snows, the budding of spring, and all the while, he waited, not for rescue, but for the moment he would be called to account. He knew it would come. The Council of Constance was being convened, a great assembly of cardinals, bishops, and theologians meant to heal the church's divisions and address the unrest bubbling across Europe. He was invited to attend, promised safe conduct, promised a chance to speak, to defend, to explain. But as he prepared to leave Bohemia, as he folded his few writings and gathered his thoughts, there must have been somewhere within him a quiet knowledge that this journey would not be like the ones before, that the silence of the countryside which had become so familiar, so clarifying, might soon give way to something far colder. Still, he did not resist. He believed in the power of words. He believed, perhaps naively, that reason could prevail over politics. And so, with no escort but conscience, Jan Hus rode away from the wind and parchment and into the gathering storm. But before that, before the trial and the stake and the smoke, there was this moment, a teacher without students, a priest without a pulpit, sitting by candlelight, listening to the rustling of leaves, the hush of a world not yet awake, and the soft turning of a page. In that stillness, the question remained unanswered, but deeply felt. Could a man speak the truth and still belong to the institution built to guard it? In the late autumn of 1414, Jan Hus departed Bohemia, quietly and with intention, riding not toward sanctuary, but toward scrutiny, summoned to stand before the Council of Constance, an assembly more complex than any one man could understand fully, and more political than its spiritual pretenses would admit. The council had not been convened. For him alone its primary purpose was far broader, a decades-long crisis during which multiple popes had claimed legitimacy, fracturing the unity of the Catholic Church. 3 men, each in their own palace, each with their own court and followers, all claimed to sit in the seat of St. Peter. The council sought to resolve this chaos, to reassert the singular authority of Rome, and to reaffirm the Church's power to define truth. And yet among its many agendas, it had made space for Jan Hus, not because he was central to the Church's structural crisis, but because his ideas, quiet, moral, and scripturally rooted, had begun to ripple through Europe, unsettling the very foundations the council hoped to reinforce. Hus, for his part, did not arrive as a rebel expecting punishment. He came, still, as a priest who believed the Church could be reasoned with. He brought with him not swords, not protests, but books, his writings, his citations, his appeals to Scripture, folded carefully into leather pouches, guarded more by conviction than by any earthly force. He had been granted safe conduct by Emperor Sigismund himself, a formal guarantee that he would not be harmed, that he could speak freely and return to Bohemia regardless of the outcome. The document was sealed with imperial authority, worded with legal precision. For Husses, this was not just a political safeguard, it was a symbol of faith in the institution he had spent his life within. If the emperor could promise justice, and the Church could offer hearing, then perhaps reform did not require fracture. Perhaps even now, amid the power plays and posturing of Europe's most senior clerics, a man with clarity of conscience could still be heard. And so he came to Constance, a city bustling with delegates and guards, merchants, and mendicants, its narrow streets clogged with horses and robes, its inns filled with cardinals and scholars, spies and scribes. The city sat beside a still lake, its waters cold and smooth, mirroring the grey sky above. Its air was thick with incense, smoke, and the murmured dealings of those who had travelled for weeks to reach this place. As Hus arrived, he would have passed beneath stone arches and between soldiers who bore neither hostility nor welcome just protocol. The council's sessions were held in great halls, where banners hung heavy from ceiling beams and voices echoed off stone walls worn with centuries of prayer and politic. Within these chambers, decisions were made not with debate alone, but with gestures, alliances, compromises, inked behind closed doors. Here, robes mattered more than words, and the chain of ecclesiastical hierarchy could be felt in the way eyes averted. Hus entered not as a peer, but as a problem to be managed. He had barely arrived before that promise of safety, so recently granted, began to dissolve not in a violent moment, but in a slow erosion of silence and protocol. He was asked to remain in Constance, not to speak yet, but to wait. Days passed. Then guards arrived, politely at first, then more firmly. He was told he was not to leave his lodgings. Then he was told he was not to receive visitors. Then he was transferred from guest to prisoner, without formal declaration, without trial, without charge. They said he would be safe, but the silence that followed his arrival was heavier than any prison gate. His cell was in a Dominican monastery, later in a castle's stone rooms that held the dampness of centuries, walls that smelled of wet cloth and old smoke. He was not tortured, he was not beaten, but the air was cold, the food sparse, the light dim. His books were taken, his ink withheld. He was left with his thoughts, which turned steadily inward, not in bitterness, but in sorrow. He had come to speak, but no one would listen. Letters he wrote went unanswered. Inquiries he made were deferred. Months passed. His health declined. Illness crept in not violently, but in the quiet way that bad air and cold stones sap strength from the body day after day. When he was finally summoned to speak, it was not to a council open to dialogue, but to a courtroom draped in ceremony, populated by clerics already decided. He stood before cardinals who wore red not for blood, but for power, before bishops who saw not a man but a symbol, an inconvenience that must be resolved. He was asked to declare that his writings were in error, that he had led souls astray, that his understanding of Scripture was subordinate to that of the Church. He was not asked to debate. He was not invited to elaborate. He was asked to submit. But Hus, though weakened, though trembling from illness and isolation, still spoke calmly. He said that if anyone could show him, by Scripture, where he had erred, he would recant freely. But no Scripture was offered, only decrees, only councils, only papal rulings. Hus answered, "I prefer to obey God rather than man." These were not defiant words, but final ones. He knew, by then, that the outcome was already sealed. The council was not a place for reconciliation. It was a stage for assertion, and there was no room left for nuance. In their final judgment, the council declared Hus a heretic. He was stripped of his priestly garments, one by one, each removal a symbolic undoing of his ordination. A paper crown was placed on his head, painted with demons, bearing the word Arch. They marched him through the streets, but the people were not jubilant. They were mostly silent. Some wept, some looked away. In a field outside the city, he was bound to the stake. The wood was piled high. The executioners waited. A final offer was made. "Recant, and you will live." But Hus, eyes raised, replied that he could not lie, even to save his life. He sang a hymn as the fire was lit. The flames rose slowly. His voice faded. And then there was only smoke. The council's business resumed. A new pope was elected, but the quiet execution of Jan Hus hung in the air like the scent of ash that clung to the wind. His ashes were gathered and thrown into the Rhine, as if to erase the memory of his presence, as if water could carry away conviction. But even in that erasure, the Church had miscalculated. For Hus's ideas, softened by prayer and shaped by conscience, did not burn. They traveled, they whispered through Bohemia, echoed in sermons, reappeared in pamphlets, became seeds for movements still to come. But Hus, in that final moment, did not see legacy. He saw only truth, and the cold sky above, and the promise that had been made to him broken not in anger, but in administrative silence. The safe conduct had been given, then revoked, not with swords, but with ink. And so he died not in fury, not as a revolutionary, but as a man who came in good faith, and who, even at the end, believed that the church might still hear the voice of its own conscience. But it did not, and so, the bell tolled once more. The council moved on, and Jan Hus was gone. The morning of July 6, 1415, arrived without fanfare, without trumpet, without any great movement of wind or voice, just a slow and indifferent sky, the grey kind that seems neither to mourn nor to judge. In the city of Constance, the council's work continued as it always had, papers shuffling, sandals scuffing, stone, distant bells tolling the hour, but beneath the regularity of church routine and imperial protocol, there was the quiet understanding that a life would end that day, not in secrecy, nor in drama, but in procession. Jan Hus had spent months in confinement, his health frayed, his hopes eroded not by force but by silence. He had heard his final sentence read in full, that he was a heretic, that his teachings had defied the unity of the church, that he would be removed from priesthood, from communion, from the protection of life. But Hus had not shouted, he had not begged, he had merely listened, eyes steady, hands bound, in stillness, and when asked one final time if he would recant, he said again softly, plainly, that he could not deny what he had not been shown to be false. And so, when they brought him out that morning, it was not with chains but with escort. He walked, slowly, calmly, his steps deliberate on the uneven cobblestones, his body bowed, not in fear, but in resignation. He was clothed in the tattered remnants of his priestly robes, not as honor, but as ritual humiliation. As he reached the clearing outside the city, where the stake had already been prepared, his garments were removed one by one, each layer, taken as if peeling back the titles and duties of his vocation. A crown of paper was then placed upon his head, tall, conical, painted with the shapes of red demons and black flames. Upon it were the words Heresiarcha Archheretic written, in Gothic script for all to see. But Hus did not resist. He did not flinch. He did not bow. He stood. His lips moved in prayer, not loudly, not for the crowd, but for himself and for God. Those near him reported that he repeated the name of Christ again and again, slowly, like a breath, like the turning of a page. Around him, the crowd remained hushed, not hostile, not grieving, simply still. No one cheered. No one wept loudly. The air was heavy with the scent of grass crushed underfoot, of straw bundled near the woodpile, of torch oil on linen-wrapped handles. Monks stood at a distance, some silent in solemn judgment, others uncertain, eyes cast downward as if waiting for something to interrupt the inevitable. The wood had been stacked tall and wider, thick pillar of logs and bundles of dry kindling, all arranged carefully, methodically. The executioners moved without hurry, laying the straw in soft crunches beneath Hus's feet, binding his torso to the upright post, not with cruelty, but with routine. There was no ceremony in their movements, no mockery. It was work. The wind stirred faintly across the field, carrying the rustle of robes, the occasional cough, the creak of rope tightening around flesh. Hus stood fast. When one of the clerics offered him a final chance to recant now and all this may stop, he replied with a whisper, audible only to those closest, that he had spoken the truth, and to lie at this moment would betray not only the church he loved, but the Christ he served. It was not pride that held his voice steady. It was clarity. Conviction had settled into his bones long before the torches arrived. And then, a signal was given, not loudly, not ceremonially, just a nod from one man to another. The torches were lowered. The fire began slowly, with a gentle crackle, as if reluctant, as if uncertain whether it ought to perform its role in something so silent. The flames licked the straw, drew breath into the dry kindling, and began to rise not in fury, but in a gradual blooming of orange, gold, and grey. Hus did not scream. His mouth moved still, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in song. Some said he sang a hymn, though the words were lost in the hissing and the shifting of heat. Others said he simply kept his eyes upward, as if looking not at the smoke or the sky, but through them. The crown tilted slightly as the flames rose beneath it, curling its edges. The crowd stepped back. Some crossed themselves. A few turned away. No one shouted. No one moved forward. It was as if the entire scene existed under glass, a moment preserved in stillness, in restraint, in slow surrender. The fire moved up the wood, wrapped itself around robes and rope, and finally around flesh, but still, no cry. Only the steady breathing of wind and witness. For Hus, the end came not in agony, but in absorption. He had lived in discipline, in rhythm, in self. Death, when it came, was not an intruder, but a final entry in the same pattern. He had spent his life stepping into the word, and now he stepped into silence. A silence deeper than any he had known, deeper even than the countryside exile where only the scratch of ink and the wind had answered his thoughts. As the flames consumed the last visible parts of his figure, the light glowed against the watcher's faces, not blinding, not violent, just bright enough to cast soft, moving shadows. When it was over, when the ashes were gathered, they were not buried, they were not kept, they were scattered into the Rhine, the river that wound through Constance like a pale vein, as if the church, even in death, sought to dissolve his presence, to make him unplaceable. But rivers carry memory, waters do not forget, and the wind that had witnessed his final hour would carry whispers beyond the city, beyond the council, beyond even Bohemia. But Hus did not know this. In his final moments, there was only the wood beneath him, the dry scent of burning straw, the loosened grip of the body's frame, and the rhythm of prayer as it faded into heat and air. And somewhere beyond the edge of firelight, the bells of Constance tolled once again, not for mourning, not for triumph, but simply for the hour. A monk noted the time, a clerk recorded the name, a scribe folded the verdict into parchment. And life went on, but the field was not empty. The embers glowed long into the evening. The crown of paper, half burned, drifted into pieces on the wind. The sky darkened, the lake remained still, and somewhere, perhaps far away, a listener breathed in the stillness, the calm, the acceptance not of victory, nor of defeat, but of truth. Spoken once, and not taken back. The ashes of Jan Hus were scattered into the Rhine, carried not in a ceremony of remembrance, but in a calculated act of erasure, dust into water, memory into flow. The church authorities hoped that by dispersing his remains, they might also disperse his influence, dissolve his voice, and reduce his presence to silence through silence, not the self-imposed stillness of prayer, but the final silence of historical forgetting. And yet, just as water holds its currents long after a stone disappears beneath the surface, the teachings of Hus, calmly spoken, quietly written, never recanted, continued to move beneath the surface of Europe's religious life. In Bohemia, news of his death did not extinguish his name, it ignited it. The grief turned to defiance, and the silent admiration of his sermons turned into the shouted battle cries of a movement that bore his name, the Hasidim. They were not an army in the traditional sense, at least not at first, but a gathering of townspeople, scholars, peasants, and minor nobles, all stirred by the belief that the church had betrayed one of its own, and by extension, betrayed the truth. What began as theological mourning soon became military resistance. Over the next 2 decades, Bohemia became the site of religious war, a series of conflicts that would wound the papacy and fracture Christendom in ways not yet imaginable in Hus's lifetime. These were not peaceful uprisings. They were armed and bloody, marked by sieges and counter-sieges, by acts of iconoclasm and retaliatory. Yet even in the clamor of swords and fire, the echo of Hus's voice remained discernibly, especially in the moderate wing of the Hus, who insisted not on vengeance but on communion in both kinds, on moral reform and on the Bible as the highest authority. These ideas, once whispered in lecture halls and explained patiently in sermon, now became banners raised, not in rebellion against God, but in defense of a more honest church. The Council of Constance, so determined to restore order, had instead lit a fuse, and though Hus never called for revolution, his name became the cornerstone of Czech religious identity for generations. Martin Luther, a full century later, would read Hus's writings and recognize a spiritual predecessor. "We are all Hussites without knowing it," he once remarked, acknowledging that the Reformation, when it arrived, had roots that reached far deeper than Wittenberg. The question that Hus had asked, whether the church's teachings must submit to Scripture, would echo through pulpits, across borders, into pamphlets and university halls, always softened by time but never dulled. And still, Hus himself remained elusive. A firebrand, not a revolutionary, but a priest who believed that words mattered, that reason had a place in faith, and that silence, when chosen, could speak more powerfully than decree. His writings, once condemned to flame, survived in translation and circulation. Students copied them by hand. Preachers recited them in corners of churches, in marketplaces, in forests where reformers met in secret. Even after the Hussite War subsided, and Bohemia was pressured back toward orthodoxy, The memory of Hus endured not in triumph, but in persistence. Like the ink of his own hand, pressed into parchment with care, his ideas did not fade quickly. They darkened with age, became part of the texture of resistance, and eventually flowed into the great rivers of Protestant theology and national identity. In many ways, Hus became more powerful in absence than in presence. His death removed him from debate, but transformed him into symbol. And yet, the symbol was never louder than the man himself had been. He remained, always, a quiet figure, not passive, but contemplative. A teacher who did not seek crowds, but welcomed them. A thinker who submitted to the church until the moment submission would have required dishonesty. A man who loved the institution he was accused of destroying, and that paradox is what preserved him. In the centuries that followed, councils met again, popes rose and fell, empires shifted their borders, and theology turned inward, outward, and back again. But Hus remained in the margins of texts, in the footnotes of reformers, in the whispered traditions of Czech villages where old women told children that once, long ago, a man stood in fire and did not cry out. His voice lingered, not because it was defiant, not because it incited, but because it endured. The institutional machine that condemned Himrich learned. Politically, Ahmed has left behind volumes of decisions and many of which are unread, forgotten, buried in archives. But the words of Hus remain accessible, still read today. Modest, sharp, clear. Seek the truth. Listen to the truth. Teach the truth. Love the truth. Abide by the truth. And defend the truth unto death. He wrote this not as a manifesto, but as a reminder. And it is this, the slow, unwavering rhythm of conviction, that has outlived the flames. His voice was not erased by scattering his ashes in the Rhine. Water cannot unwrite what has already entered the mine. It can carry memory. It can ripple truth. And in the long current of history, Hus became a presence felt just beneath the surface's submerged root from which larger movements grew. The Reformation would not truly begin for another 100 years, but when it did, it arrived already familiar with fire. Hus's name was whispered in Protestant circles across Europe, cited in sermons, venerated in songs. Statues were later raised in his honor. Schools and churches bore his name. But perhaps most telling of all, even where his legacy was politically inconvenient, spiritually risky, or culturally divisive, the silence around him could never be fully restored. In the end, the tragedy of Hus's death was not the fire itself, but the system that chose not to listen before it burned him. And the miracle of his life was not that he foresaw revolution, but that he stood still in its earliest tremors and moved, unflinching, wrapped not in rebellion, but in principle. And so the listener may now rest not stirred by drama, but stilled by understanding. The story of Hus is not one of dramatic conquest or spectacular defeat. It is a story of stillness, a steady faith, a quiet insistence, a belief that even under pressure, one may stand. The world around him changed. The councils continued. The wars came. The princes argued. But the voice of Hus remained in the margin of a handwritten note, in the footfall of a country priest, in the rhythm of those who dare to question without shouting. In that way Hus did not die. He entered history not in ash, but in ink, and the page, once written, cannot be unmade. In a quiet corner of the Benicky Rare Book and Manuscript Library in New Haven, Connecticut, beneath soft light filtered through high glass, behind locked drawers of polished wood rests, a book unlike any other, bound in limp vellum, thick with pages made from the stretched skin of calves, long turned to dust. The Voynich manuscript waits. It does not beckon. It does not reveal. It waits, whole and silent, as it has for centuries, unhurried and entire. If you were to hold a tan fume, you would notice, first, its texture. The way the vellum resists your fingertips slightly. A soft tension, like parchment, breathing. It is neither brittle nor smooth, but something in between, but preserved, bearing the weight of use and stillness alike. The spine gives a soft creak as it opens, a sound like dried reeds gently bending. The smell is deep and layered. Old ink and stretched leather, mingled with a faint sweetness of time, as if dust has long since made peace with its home. You would not be inclined to speak here. In the room where it lies, even breath feels heavy, reverent. The air, though climate-controlled, carries the hush of a chapel, and when your eyes fall to the first page, you are greeted not by clarity, nor even confusion, but by something else entirely, an invitation to wonder, not in noise, but in silence. The script that fills the Voynich manuscript flows smoothly across each page, letter after letter, unbroken, elegant, assured, but no one knows what it says. The alphabet is unknown, the language untraceable. It is not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, Arabic, or even a known cipher. The shapes seem familiar at first, a kind of slanted script with loops and curves, as if borrowed from several scripts at once, but they resolve into no recognizable words. Yet there is rhythm, there is order, the spacing is even. The scribe makes no corrections. It feels not like babble, but intent. Some pages contain brief annotations, in Latin or faded notations, but the core of the manuscript resists interpretation. Scholars have tried for decades, even centuries. Linguists, cryptographers, monks, soldiers, poets, mathematicians, but the Voynich manuscript is not a code to be cracked. Or if it is a code that breathes, one that listens back, one that remembers. Across its 240 pages, the text is punctuated by illustrations, hundreds of them, some detailed, others vague, all arresting. There are plants that seem almost real starburst flowers, forked roots, branching stems, but none have yet been found in nature. They resemble something half remembered from a dream, or rendered from memory of a world. Not quite this one. Turn the page and you enter a different section. Cosmic wheels, zodiac symbols, celestial chart, stars mapped in circles, moons divided into halves, women holding orbs, floating in ether. There are nude figures, mostly female, bathing in green pools connected by piping systems that resemble distillation equipment or medieval plumbing. The women gesture, point, float, never speaking, always within systems of flow. Further on, pharmaceutical diagrams. Roots, in jars, pages filled with labeled compartments, herbs, bundled beside what may be recipes or rituals. And finally, a long section of continuous, text-dense, uninterrupted, a tide of words in the same unbroken language, flowing from page to page like litany, like chant, like something meant to be read aloud but never translated. No punctuation, no headings, just script, steady and deliberate, not mechanical, human. Still, it was not discovered, but noticed in 1912 by a rare book dealer named Wilfred von, sifting through forgotten volumes in an Italian villa once owned by Jim. It caught his attention not because it promised riches or prestige, but because it refused to explain itself. Its silence stood out. Voynich took it to London, then to America. He shared it with scholars, hoping to ignite curiosity. He succeeded, but curiosity was not enough. The manuscript would not yield. Even today it has never been conclusively read. It does not fail to communicate. It simply has not spoken yet. Perhaps it never meant to, and so it remains a manuscript without an author, without a known reader, and yet, paradoxically, not alone. For it has become one of the most studied, analyzed, hypothesized artifacts in the history of bookmaking. Codebreakers from World War I and II attempted to decipher it. Artificial intelligence has scanned and rescanned its glyphs. Historians have traced its ink, carbon dated its parchment, and catalogued every illustrated leaf. Still, it does not answer, not because it is stubborn, but because, perhaps like a monk in silent contemplation, it believes that presence alone is enough. The Voynich manuscript does not rush. It does not challenge. It simply sits. It is, when one looks upon it, especially in a quiet moment, in a space that allows for breathing and wondering rather than solving, something else emerges. The possibility that the act of writing it, whoever wrote it, was an act of meditation. That the scribe was not trying to impress, but to capture something fleeting, internal, sacred, or a memory written in private code, like a diary in a dream tongue. The consistency of the hand, the careful coloring of the plants, the repetition of certain glyphs, it suggests not chaos, but comfort. A private order, and that is what makes the manuscript so suited to this moment, this listening, this slowing down, for it offers no answers, only the gentle insistence of presence, like the turning of a wheel, like breath, like prayer. You cannot know what it says, you cannot know who wrote it, but you can see it. You can imagine them bent over a candlelit desk, carefully dipping a quill, tracing lines into vellum with purpose but not pressure. The room around them would have been still, the only sound, the quiet scratch of ink against skin, the turning of pages, the shifting of robes. And then, when the book was full, it was closed, wrapped, hidden, not published, not sold, not explained, just preserved. Tonight, we will not decode it. That is not our purpose. We will sit with it. We will open its pages, one by one, and look not to understand, but to witness, and in witnessing, to rest. The Voynich manuscript does not demand attention. It invites reflection. A presence that has waited 5 centuries can wait a little longer in your company. As you breathe, as your eyes close, let its pages remain open in your mind. Let the script curl across your thoughts like ivy, not wrapping tightly, but gently, threading through dreams. The mystery remains, but so does the book. And sometimes that is enough. To walk slowly through the Voynich manuscript is not to move through information, but through impressions. Quiet rooms of thought where nothing is fully explained, and everything invites contemplation. The pages do not demand attention. They reward patience. The first section, often referred to by scholars as the botanical pages, unfolds with illustration after illustration of plants, drawn in deliberate line, softly inked, sometimes painted in muted greens and browns and golds. The plants seem to grow from the vellum itself, each rooted in a space that has no soil. Their tuberous roots curve and swell like sleeping limbs beneath the ground. Stems twist upward, curling in slow, uncoiling spirals, while leaves stretch like tongues, or radiate in geometric bursts like dandelions, but broader, stranger. Some resemble aloe with their long, fleshy blades. Others recall mandrake with forked roots and bulbous heads. Still others seem invented, remembered not from nature, but from dream. No botanist has ever confirmed them. No field guide has ever named them. They stand alone, somewhere between familiar and imagined, blooming only in ink, without scent or season, untethered from climate, from geography, from taxonomy, and yet they are drawn with such care, each vein of each leaf traced as if it mattered, that one cannot dismiss them. They are not doodles. They are not fantasy. They are intentional renderings. But of what? A lost fire, a symbolic herbal, a language of plant forms written for the eyes, not the tongue. You imagine the scribe bent over the page, pressing color into form, not to replicate nature, but to echo it, to create plants that feel true, even if they are not. They bloom without needing to exist. And then, without announcement, the manuscript shifts, the flora fading into the cosmos, and the reader enters what has come to be known as the astronomical section. Here, the language of stems gives way to circles, celestial wheels, zodiac signs, stars arranged in deliberate orbit. The diagrams are intricate but not ornate. They feel mechanical and mystical at once, as if drawn by someone who believed the stars were not simply points of light, but measurable truths that could heal, guide, or warn. The sun appears often, sometimes with a face, sometimes as a gold disk. The moon waxes and wanes in succession. Constellations are mapped in unfamiliar forms. Some zodiac signs are recognizable, Scorpio with its curling tail, Sagittarius with its bow, but others are rendered in ways that slip through identification. Surrounding the celestial forms are women, again, naked but not exposed, seated in circular arrangements, holding stars, or gesturing toward unknown meanings. It is tempting to call them muses, or midwives, or symbols of fate, but they do not perform. They witness. They exist within the diagrams as if to anchor the heavens to the human body, to remind us that astrology was once not entertainment, but medicine, timekeeping, theology. In the 15th century, to gaze at the night sky was not to see mystery, but structure, stars as the scaffolding of time, each planet a ruler of bodily humors and destiny, and without the light of electricity, the sky would have been full, dense, with stars, pulsing with myth. You imagine the manuscript's creator, gazing upward from a quiet hill, trying to record not the shape of constellations, but the feeling they gave, the sense that everything above was connected to everything within. The next section, often called biological or balneological, is in many ways the most enigmatic, and the most tender. These pages are populated not by plants or planets, but by women, drawn in soft curves, often unclothed, always in motion. They bathe in pools, submerge in barrels, stand in streams that connect to each other through flowing pipes and tube-like structures. They are not erotic, not even sensual, but ritualistic. Part of a system, a pattern. Water flows through the pages like breath through the body. The women raise their arms, gesture toward each other, recline as if in conversation. Though their mouths never open, their bodies are drawn with a simplicity that evokes utility rather than display, like diagrams of circulation or quiet veneration of the human form. These may be representations of medieval bathing practices, or perhaps symbolic images of fertility, healing, even conception. They may be saints, or stand-ins for elements, fire, water, air, earth, or they may be none of those. They do not speak, but they float, connected not by words, but by water. Water as metaphor, water as medicine, water as womb. You imagine the pools not as spas, but as shrines, not for luxury, but for transformation. In an age when most water carried disease, these images suggest water as purification, as holy transition. These women, silent and repeated, feel like echoes of an unseen theology, one not written in Latin, but drawn in curves. Following them, the manuscript flows into the pharmaceutical section, where structure returns, in the form of jars, roots, labeled compartments. It feels at once more organized and more obscure. The plants here are fragmented, reduced to parts, leaves, stems, bulbs, placed beside vessels that resemble alchemical glassware, or apothecary containers. There are no flames, no gold, but there is repetition. Each plant part is associated with a label, a diagram, a measurement perhaps. The overall effect is calm, even domestic. You imagine the interior of a small medieval herb room, a monastery's apothecary, perhaps, or the back chamber of a healer's cottage. Shelves lined with ceramic jars, dusted with time, bundles of dried mint hanging from ceiling beams, mortar and pestle resting in a carved bowl, the scent of sage, rosemary, lavender, crushed in preparation for poultices or tinctures. There is no modern division between medicine and mysticism here. A root might treat fever, a flower might ease childbirth, the powder might soothe melancholy or summon sleep. The manuscript does not tell us what these are, but it tells us they mattered, that someone believed enough in these herbs to render them, label them, associate them with meaning. You imagine someone tracing a recipe from these pages, not to cure, but to care, and then, without warning, the structure dissolves, the images fade, the diagrams fall away, and the final section of the Voynich manuscript is page after page of dense, uninterrupted script. No illustrations, no divisions, just a flow of words. The same untranslatable language, unbroken and unyielding. It reads like something ancient and devotional, a voice that never stops to breathe. The letters rise and fall in rhythmic cadence. Some scholars believe this is a collection of recipes based on patterns in the text. Others say it is poetry or a stream of consciousness monologue. But the manuscript does not say there are no titles, no numbers, just lines, measured, eternal. It feels like someone speaking to themselves or to God. The text is not chaotic. It is not urgent. It simply is. You can imagine reading it aloud, not to understand, but to hear the shape of sound, the weight of syllables never translated. Perhaps this is the purest form of language. Sound without meaning, meaning without constraint. Or perhaps it is not language at all, but meditation, an act of writing, not to communicate, but to remember how to move hand over page. And as your eyes grow heavy, and the letters begin to blur, it no longer matters what it says, only that someone wrote it, and that it remains. In the century since the Voynich manuscript re-emerged into scholarly light, it has drawn not the boisterous crowds of conquest but the quiet footsteps of the persistent and the patient. Men and women who sit at desks surrounded by notes and diagrams, who whisper to themselves and to the pages, hoping that this time something might yield. And yet, it never has. Among the first serious attempts to decode the manuscript came in the years between the world wars, when former soldiers and intelligence officers, those who had broken ciphers that had once hidden the orders of empires, turned their attention to this small silent book. They were cryptographers, trained in the arts of pattern recognition and substitution, in tracing the structure beneath the chaos. Their rooms were dimly lit by green glass desk lamps, their tables spread with thick reams of paper and frequency tables, rulers laid flat, sharpened pencils at the ready. The air smelled of coffee and old leather, of ink and worn suits. They had decrypted the secrets of military machines, of hidden messages encoded by typewriter cogs. They had listened to the static of intercepted transmissions and extracted truth from noise. But the Voynich manuscript, it defied them. Its language did not follow the logic of codes. Its repetitions were too orderly to be random, too unpredictable to be structured. They decrypted armies, but not this. Some left detailed notebooks, filled with crossed-out theories and hesitant arrows connecting glyphs to letters. Others simply set their pens down and walked away. Not in frustration, not in defeat, but in quiet awe, as if the book had gently reminded them that not all locks are meant to be picked. As technology advanced, the manuscript entered a new phase of scrutiny, not by hand, but by algorithm. Linguists, computer scientists, and statisticians fed its pages into programs, breaking down the shapes into data points, assigning values to strokes, mapping frequencies of occurrence. Whole sentences were converted into numbers. Networks were plotted to show which glyphs followed which, and how often. It became, briefly, not a manuscript but a matrix, an array of patterns. AI programs were trained to simulate decoding attempts, drawing comparisons to known languages, two meaningless gibberish, two musical compositions. The hope was that, with enough input, the machine might see what the mind could not. But it didn't. Even the machine listens, but hears only rhythm, not message. The algorithms found order, yes, but order alone is not meaning. Repetition suggests grammar, but not purpose. Structure implies language, but the absence of context renders it mute. And so, line after line of code was written, run, revised, and rewritten. Statistical models were published in journals. Machine learning outputs were shared in forums, and the manuscript remained as it was. Not solved, not diminished, simply observed, more deeply than ever, and still unread. And then there are the theories, each one rising, like a gentle hypothesis, offered in good faith, examined, then slowly dissolved under the weight of time. Some believe it to be a hoax, a clever forgery crafted to appear meaningful while carrying no message at all. The 16th century had its share of charlatans and tricksters, and a mysterious book could fetch a fine price. But if it were a hoax, why such care? Why the precise and consistent handwriting, the botanical illustrations colored with gentle, deliberate brushwork? Why the subtle evolution of glyphs across pages, the effort to maintain aesthetic coherence over hundreds of folios? Most hoaxes aim to impress quickly. This one whispers across centuries. Others insist it must be a cipher, awaiting its key polyalphabetic code, perhaps, or a complex transposition. But centuries of brilliant minds have offered keys, and the door remains closed. Each proposed cipher works for a few lines, then collapses under its own exceptions. Some suggest the manuscript may be an example of glossolalia or an invented language, produced by someone in a trance-like state, or seeking to create a private liturgy. This theory explains the fluidity, the internal consistency, the lack of corrections. And yet, it also suggests the work of a single, consistent mind over time, someone dedicated not to deception, but to expression, even without audience. It does not feel mad, it feels meditative. In all these theories, there is a pattern of rising hope and falling acceptance. A new theory emerges. Perhaps it is a forgotten dialect, a form of proto-romance, or a women's medical text in code. A burst of excitement around a press headlines. And then, silence. The theory dissolves. The manuscript returns to stillness. Every answer is a mirror, reflecting the reader more than the book. Some see alchemy, others astronomy. Some see feminism, others occultism. But the Voynich manuscript sees nothing. It simply waits, and this, perhaps, is its greatest lesson. That not all mysteries demand resolution. That some things, by enduring unread, become more than readable. They become companions in thought. The attempts at decoding the manuscript are not failures. They are pilgrimages, journeys through ink, logic, hope, and humility. And each failed attempt leaves behind not frustration, but a kind of reverence, a bowed head, a paused breath. The manuscript does not rebuke those who try, it welcomes them, and when they leave, it remains unchanged. A book without an author, without a reader, without a translation, but not without meaning. The meaning is in the gesture, the reaching, the turning of the page. The night spent under lamplight, believing that maybe, in one more glyph, a door might open. That belief, even when unanswered, has its own sacredness. Tonight, we do not attempt to decode, we simply rest among those who have tried. We sit in the quiet company of questions, and let the manuscript be what it always has been, present, patient, and whole. There is a peculiar comfort in things we do not understand, not because they defy us, but because they remained undisturbed, unbroken, whole in their silence. The Voynich manuscript is one such thing. Page after page of it stretches before us not with demands, but with stillness. It does not call for explanation. It does not beg for meaning. It simply sits, ink over vellum, glyphs in sequence, waiting without expectation, existing without compromise. And perhaps that is its greatest power. We often speak of puzzles and riddles and unsolved mysteries as problems, as things that must be decoded or cracked open, as if their worth lies only in our ability to master them. But what if the value of the Voynich lies not in being solved, but in being unsolved? Well, perhaps it is not a failure of language, but a different kind of speech, one that does not move from sender to receiver, but from silence to presence. Perhaps the manuscript is not broken. Perhaps it is complete in its silence. Like a bell that rings in a closed room, the sound circles and settles into something felt, not heard. Its words may never be understood, but their form curved, flowing, deliberate carries something else. The human instinct to leave a mark, not always to teach or to argue, but to be seen, even without recognition. It is a manuscript, yes, but it is also a meditation, a practice, a ritual of creation in a world that rarely explains itself. History, we often believe, is made of facts, dates, names, causes, effects, but not all truths survive through clarity. Some endure through presence. An old shoe in the corner of a preserved house, a faded name on a stone wall, a song whose lyrics are lost, but whose melody still hums in the mind. These are fragments not of broken understanding, but of continuous feeling. The Voynich manuscript lives in that category not as a record of what was, but as a witness to what mattered enough to preserve. It has passed through fire and flood, through war and neglect. It has crossed borders and centuries, and still, it lies open to those who would look not to decode, but to notice. It may never give us facts, but it gives us time. It gives us the sensation of sitting beside something that does not need to explain itself to be real. Some truths speak not in language, but in long silence, and we are no less human for listening. Long ago, monks in high stone rooms copied psalms they could not always interpret. They traced the letters of sacred texts in Latin or Greek or Hebrew, languages they may not have spoken. But still, they wrote. They bent over their work in candlelight. They dipped their quills and breathed slowly. They did not understand every word, but they believed in the act of copying. They believed in the rhythm of lines, in the cadence of scripture, in the power of repetition. They believed, too, that some texts were not meant to be unraveled, but inhabited, to be sat with, to be read aloud like prayer, even if the meaning drifted above comprehension. In this way, the Voynich manuscript feels like a cousin to those illuminated texts. It may not contain dogma or theology, but it shares the posture of reverence. It shares the slowness of devotion. We may not chant its words, but we can breathe with them. We can let them pass through us like mist, not holding, not grasping, simply receiving. And this is where it becomes not just text, but art. Not in the modern sense of spectacle or gallery, but in the older sense, art as presence, art as practice, art as something made with care, not necessarily to be explained. A painting on a cave wall, a stone bowl carved by hand, a melody hummed without lyrics. There is a way that art works even when we do not fully understand it. You can listen to music in a language you do not speak, and still it moves you. Still, it reaches inside something unlabeled. The Voynich manuscript is like that, like a song from a distant room. Its rhythm familiar, its voice unknown, yet strangely close. You do not need to translate it to feel its shape. You do not need to know its purpose to find peace in its pages. There is meaning here, but not the kind that can be tested or proved. It is the meaning of persistence, of endurance, of the human will to shape thoughts into symbols, even when the audience is not clear. And maybe that is enough, maybe more than enough. In a world that chases productivity and explanation, there is something revolutionary about sitting with what refuses to be solved, something radical in letting things be quiet, in letting things remain unknown. The Voynich manuscript resists urgency. It invites pause. Its mystery is not a hole to be filled, but a space to rest in. To sit beside a book that has waited 500 years and not feel the need to unlock it, that is a kind of wisdom. To look at its pages and say, I do not know, and still feel reverence, that is a kind of peace. This is not resignation. This is not failure. This is the embrace of a deeper Piacenza willingness to let meaning live outside of words. And so we arrive here, at the end of this segment, not with an answer, but with a companion, not with conclusions, but with presence. The Voynich manuscript remains what it always has, been folded, bound, but in the act of reading, of looking, of wondering, it becomes something more. It becomes a mirror to our own minds, our own longing to explain, and it gently reminds us that we do not always need to, that some things endure not because they are understood, but because they are beautifully unknowable. Some books are written to be read, some are written to be seen, and some, like this, are written to endure. And so, we sit here, quietly, in the lingering company of a book that has never spoken a word aloud, yet somehow has whispered through the centuries with an unchanging breath. The Voynich manuscript rests again where we found it, not solved, not disturbed, not reimagined as something louder or clearer, but gently acknowledged, like a stranger seen across a long corridor of time, nodding without words. We do not decode it tonight. We do not force meaning into its quiet glyphs. We do not extract answers from its silence. We simply keep it companied, the way one keeps company with the stars, not to understand their fire, but to feel their presence. It lies beneath its protective case now, under the tempered glass and filtered light of the Binnicky Library, surrounded by the hush of archival quiet. The climate around it is carefully controlled, but the stillness it emits is older than any modern preservation technique. It is the stillness of a page turned slowly by hands, long gone, of a language never spoken aloud, of ink that dried centuries ago, and never faded. You might imagine a beam of afternoon light crossing its cover at just the right angle to catch the grain of the vellum, the way it glows softly like candle wax, the faint curve of a page slightly lifted by humidity or memory. Even in dormancy, it waits, whole in its mystery, asking nothing more than to remain. We leave it not with conclusions but with calm, not with triumph but with tenderness. A mystery does not need solving to be complete. Some books are meant not to be opened, but to be approached. Some texts do not ask for readers, only for witnesses. Some languages do not wish to be translated, only watched as one watches wind move through leaves wordless, and therefore eternal. But now, slowly, gently, we begin to shift not away from stillness, but into a different kind. We leave behind the private silence of ink and parchment, and step into the curated quiet of stone and silver, where the Voynich manuscript offered a whisper of individual mystery. Our next journey, US into the structured grandeur of ecclesiastical authority, not monk's cell but the bishop's hall, not the simplicity of anonymity but the curated presence of prestige, where glyphs curled into indecipherable rhythm. Now we will walk past tapestries, banqueting tables, altar cloths of silk, and voices that echo not in forgotten tongues, but in ritualized power. We move from a book that asked for nothing to a world that took everything, yet wrapped its staking in holy language and cloistered customs. We step into a castle, yes, but not one of kings. This is the domain of mitres and rings, of brocade vestments, and jeweled goblets, of sacred Latin and secret negotiations. Here, the walls are lined not with unreadable scripts, but with ledgers, charters, censers, and relics. The air does not hum with questions. It resonates with certainty or the performance of it. And yet, beneath all that certainty, beneath the order of choirs and the measured steps of liturgy, there is another kind of silence, one dressed in velvet, one walking on polished stone, one that knows how to say everything without revealing anything at all. From this world of ink and enigma, we now turn to the world of wealth and form, where faith was wrapped in ceremony, where silence wore gold robes, and where luxury hid behind cloister walls. Let us walk slowly into this next space, then not to be impressed, not to judge, but simply to observe. As we watch the Voynich manuscript without needing to understand it, so too we will witness this world without needing to critique or condemn. We will see what was the meal rituals of the bishop's household, the hierarchy of servants and clerics, the balancing act between poverty sworn and wealth possessed. We will step into the candlelight of a private chapel where embroidered kneelers cushion the weight of power. We will sit at long oak tables where silver platters cool slowly in the draught of stone corridors. We will hear not chants of unknown syllables, but the clink of goblets, the rustle of silk, the soft shuffle of trained servants who know when to vanish. In this final segment, we will not return to hardship or mystery, but to contrast. We will watch how the same church that called for humility also carved ceilings that mimicked the heavens, how the same institution that praised silence also built orchestras of visual and material wealth to echo its voice across nations, and we will do so gently, with curiosity, not scorn. Because just as the manuscript taught us that understanding is not required for reverence, so, to this castle, this domain of spiritual wealth reminds us that even power wears a mask, and even gold-tipped silence can feel heavy. So rest your mind once more. Let the mystery of the voynich slip back into shadow. Let the curves of its letters dissolve into the edges of sleep, and follow now, softly, toward a world where mystery does not hide, but is dressed in finery. A world where the echoes of prayers meet the echoes of knives on platters. A world where power and piety walk hand in hand, under painted ceilings, past quiet fountains, behind stone walls that keep in both faith and fortune. The doors of the bishop's castle are just ahead. The torches flicker. The feast is being prepared, and the silence we enter now is not the silence of the forgotten, but the silence of control. Let us step through it slowly, together. In the bishop's great hall, silence was not absence, it was arrangement. It was not the stillness of neglect, but the cultivated hush of expectation, like the still air before a bell rings, or the breath drawn just before a psalm begins. The hall was long and cool, the floor covered in dried, rushes laced with herbs thyme, lavender, marjoram, replaced every few weeks by servants trained not only in labor, but in discretion. Overhead, beams of darkened oak stretched high into the shadows, while along the walls, heavy banners hung like stitched hymns, thick with thread and the scent of old incense. Some depicted saints, others bore the arms of the bishopric or ancient patrons whose names were no longer spoken aloud, but who still watched, silently, in silk. The air was dim, touched with smoke, not thick but constant, perfumed by candles made of beeswax, a luxury noted only by those who understood how rarely such candles flickered in the homes of the poor. The meal was not yet underway, but, already, the performance had begun. The goblet was lifted, the bread was broken, the silence was observed. Every action in this hall had meaning. Every seat was chosen, every step When the bishop entered, it was not as a man, it was as a role, a presence, a figure robed in fine linen, edged in gold, his ringed hand lifted not to greet. The silence did not shatter. It shifted deep. Behind him, slowly, came the clerics of lower rank, the archdeacon, the steward, the cupbearer. Each man knew where to sit. Each garment bore embroidery like punctuation. The guests, if any, were already seated on the far side of the table, facing inward. The bishop's seat was central, not to dominate, but to connect their axis of ritual. The table itself was broad and gleaming, polished to a dull mirror by years of cloth and elbow. Along its surface, pewter chargers caught the candlelight in soft ripples. Silver knives lay beside them, not sharp, but weighty and each marked with the cross. Salt was presented not in humble wooden bowls, but in silver vessels shaped like miniature shrines, topped with filigree steeples, a covered ewer for water, a matching one for wine. Even the spoons had handles curled like tendrils of ivy or the tails of dragons hand-forged, never cast, each slightly unique. There was no laughter, there was no conversation yet. This was not an inn, but a stage. The meal proceeded, not all at once, but in acts. First, the servers appeared, 2 at a time, carrying long trays of bread and dark loaves for the lower clergy, and softer white wheat rounds for the higher guests. The bishop received his directly, with a slight bow. No knife touched it. Then, a carver approached with the first meat, roasted peacock, its skin brushed with saffron and its tail feathers reaffixed after cooking to mimic splendor. The bird was not eaten by the bishop. It was for show, for for precedent. The peacock passed down the table but was rarely touched. What followed was more humble venison stew with root vegetables, steaming quietly in lidded bowls. Trenchers were changed between courses, not for hygiene, but for formality. Dishes came in pairs, spiced fruits and cold fish, sweetened onions and roast goose, almond milk pudding and preserved cherries, all served in rhythm, all removed with discretion. Between courses, a singer entered, young, robed, soft-voiced. He did not sing songs of joy, but psalms in plains, his voice rising only slightly above the clink of cups and the rustle of linen. His words were in Latin. No one answered, but still, he sang. Each server had a role, each role a lineage. The cupbearer position of intimacy and trust did not simply pour wine. He observed. He waited for the bishop's hand to rise or pause, for his glance to shift. He knew when to refill, when to step back. His task was both nourishment and choreography. The carver, often a noble's second son or a knight's servant, had trained for years not to butcher, but to portion to know the joints of a duck, the softest cut of lamb, the right angle to slice without tearing the skin. His knife was not for defense, but display. The steward kept time. The doorman controlled sound. The under-butler oversaw water, towel, basin. Even the silence was maintained, deliberately broken only by ceremonial prayer or by the bishop's rare instruction. And when he spoke, it was slowly, not casual, not indulgent, but as part of the rhythm. The goblet was lifted, the bread was broken, the silence was observed. No part of the meal was excessive by noble standards. There was no chaos, no gluttony, but neither was it poor. The dishes were not loud in flavor, but layered honeyed carrots, mustard seeds, in oil, custard stiffened with rose water and egg. The wine was red, from vineyards owned by the deer. The water was chilled from a nearby cistern, brought in glazed jugs from the kitchens. Occasionally, a relic would be brought in and placed quietly on the sideboard. A bone in a crystal tube, a shred of linen, a chalice used only on feast days, not as blessing, but as reminder. This was the church. This was authority. This was sacred. And sacredness, here, was velvet. Outside the hall, the kitchens echoed with another rhythm. Pots lifted, lids thudded down, herbs crushed under stone. But even there, the noise was muted. Orders were whispered, footsteps were practiced. A dropped ladle was a failure of training. The entire estate moved like a slow wheel, turning always around the bishop's table. Servants who passed by never looked in. Clerks who crossed the threshold bowed once, then vanished. The meal could last hours, but never dragged. Time here was not a burden. It was part of the spell. This was not merely food. This was theology made visible, abundance, without extravagance, ritual without explanation. The bishop, who had taken vows of humility, ate from silver. The bishop, who spoke of Christ's suffering, reclined on cushions stitched with gold thread. And yet, in this contradiction, there was no embarrassment, no apology. The poverty was sworn with one hand, roast goose in the other. The logic was not material, it was symbolic. Just as the altar was covered in lace, just as the gospel book was bound in ivory, so too the meal had to reflect glory not for the man, but for the office. The person may be flawed, but the seat was divine. And when the final dish had been cleared, and the final goblet emptied, the singer returned not to praise, but to dismiss. A short antiphon, a final amen. The bishop rose. His chair was removed behind him as he stood. No scraping of wood, no sound of heels, and with that, he left. The others followed. The room emptied, in order. The torches were snuffed 2 at a time. The silence returned, not the quiet of emptiness, but the stillness of a stage after the curtain has fallen. The goblet was lifted. The bread was broken. The silence was observed. Behind the public ritual of the feast, behind the polished gestures and prescribed glances of the banquet hall, lay another room, a space not for performance, but for prayer or, perhaps, something quieter than prayer. The bishop's private chapel was not grand in size, but in presence. Its walls were stone, thick and cool, with narrow arched windows that filtered daylight through panes of hand-blown glass, each imperfect, warping the outside world into fragments of blue and gold. Along the eastern wall, an altar of polished white marble reflected the low flicker of a single red sanctuary lamp, ever burning, suspended on a chain of blackened brass. The floor was tiled in small geometric patterns, greens, creams, ochres, and, beneath the flickering light, they appeared to move slightly, as though alive. The scent of frankincense, built up over decades, had soaked deep into the stones. It lingered not as smoke, but as memory, caught in the porous walls and the folds of the velvet niala that rested before the altar. That niala, worn smooth in the center, was once crimson, now darkened to the color of dried wine. It bore the imprint of Huguenots from generations of men, but from one, the bishop, who came here alone, sometimes nightly, sometimes not. And when he did, he came not in the brocade of the banquet, but in soft linen, a plain stole draped over his shoulders, a book, always a book, held close to his chest. His steps on the stone echoed once, then softened. Here, no one announced his presence. There were no trumpets, only the soft click of the latch as the chapel door closed, the scrape of wood as he pulled the small oak bookstand toward him, and the low rustle of pages turned with deliberate care. He would kneel in silence, and the silence would not speak back. He prayed aloud, but the room answered only in echoes. The prayer was not theatrical, not offered for the benefit of others. but neither was it wholly private. It was ritual again, a script learned long ago. The Latin phrases were familiar, the rhythm comforting. In this space, lit only by the low oil lamp and perhaps a taper if the hour was late, the bishop was not a figure of authority, but a soul performing maintenance. Spiritual upkeep, not searching for epiphany, but maintaining the rhythm that had carried him from novice to prelate. The breviary in his hands was leather-bound, its corners darkened by years of touch. Inside, beneath the Latin prayers, were marginalia tiny notes he had written to himself, a reminder to add a name to the intercessions, a question about a psalm's phrasing, a mark to denote a passage worth returning to. These were the closest thing he had to a diary, a record not of thoughts, but of spiritual concerns, written not in confession but in notations. Occasionally, when the shadows grew long and the fire low, he would pause his recitation and simply look upward, toward the small crucifix above the altar carved from ivory and hung on a cross of walnuts, simple, clean, cool in its minimalism. He did not weep. He did not speak. He watched. And the crucifix watched back. Yet this chapel was not untouched by politics. Just beyond the wooden door stood a servant, always one stationed not to intrude, but to ensure that if a message came from the archdeacon, or if the hour grew dangerously late, someone was present to intervene with discretion. The bishop's personal secretary, a quiet man named Oni in records, would arrive each morning to gather any new documents the bishop had worked on overnight, wax tablets with impressions from his stylus, or notes marked in the margins of a book meant for further copying. This secretary did not knock. He entered only when the candle was extinguished. In this way, the chapel was both a sacred space and a political one, where privacy existed not to escape the world, but to manage it without witness. The bishop's prayer life was real, sincere in its rhythms, but it was never invisible. Even silence, in this space, was curated. Attached to the chapel, through a small archway, was the bishop's chamber, his sleeping room, his study, his final retreat from the external world. Here, the air was even more still. A high canopy bed stood at the center, its curtains of woven wool lined with silk, not garish, but practical in weight, thick enough to hold warmth, dyed a shade of green that mimicked the moss along the courtyard fountain. On either side of the bed were two small tables. One held a shallow basin and pitcher, the other a candelabrum of 3 arms, never fully lit. At the foot of the bed, a wooden chest bound in iron straps held garments and vestments, folded with the same care given to altar cloths. The walls were hung with tapestries not for display, but for insulation. One depicted a stylized vine curling around a cross, another a map of the known world in rough approximation, its oceans imagined, its borders dreamt. In one corner stood a writing desk, angled toward the window, where morning light might catch the edge of a parchment. On this desk sat a series of items, each placed just so: an inkhorn of dark blue glass, a narrow quill knife for trimming, a collection of wax seals, a roll of ribbon, and a wooden box containing sand for blood. Nearby, several wax tablets, smooth, black, slightly scuffed, bore the faint indentations of plans. The desk chair was plain, the cushion on it stuffed with feathers, and beneath the desk, stacked neatly, were books, some religious, some legal, 1 or 2 in Greek, 1 in Hebrew. They smelled of dry vellum and faint mold, the comforting decay of knowledge at rest. A crucifix hung near the bed, twin to the one in the chapel, and beside it, a small lamp in a bronze bracket, kept burning on winter nights. The only sound in this room came from the fire in the wall hearth, when lit, or from the slow creak of wood contracting in the cold. Occasionally, the bishop would rise in the night, walk to the desk, and write nothing urgent, just a notation, a word, a line of thought, too vague for daylight. He might unroll a charter and read it by, or he might simply stand at the window, looking out at the cloister garden. Dark and quiet, the silhouettes of hedges like rows of sleeping figures, and this was the rhythm of his solitude. Not isolation, not penance, but quiet maintenance of identity, a balance between public role and private self. This chamber was both cell and throne, both sacred and strategic. Here, decisions were shaped. Here, worries unfolded in silence. Here, robes were removed, rings set down, mitres hung from carved pegs. And here too, the man inside the office remembered what it was to speak not in judgment or pronouncement, but in prayer. Sometimes, before sleep, he would open a small book of hours and whisper the final verse aloud, his breath visible in the chill. his hands folded, the words familiar and final. Then, extinguishing the lamp, he would lie down. The canopy drawn, the stone room still. Outside, the servants did not speak, the secretary did not record, the door stayed closed, and the only sound that lingered was the slow, rhythmic exhale of sleep. Beneath the velvet of the bishop's vestments, beneath the rituals of the altar and the stillness of the chapel, there was another garment woven not of cloth, but of administration, of record-keeping and policy, of ink and wax and numbers that carried the weight of grain and gold. This was the bishop not as priest, but as administrator, a landowner, a lawgiver, a quiet engine of governance, humming within stone walls. His palace may have echoed with psalms, but it also breathed with the low rustle of parchment, the scrape of styluses on wax, the creak of ledgers opening beneath fingers trained to tally both souls and sheep. Each morning, before matins were complete, the first stack of correspondence would arrive, folded letters sealed with wax, sometimes bearing the insignia of far-off abbeys or distant nobles, sometimes carried by local couriers with ink-streaked hands and worn boots. These messages bore requests for judgment, records of tithe, updates on tenant disputes, inquiries into diocesan law, and sometimes discreet pleas for pardon. The bishop did not read them all himself. He employed a secretary, fluent in Latin, who first sorted the documents by urgency, placing the routine accounts in one stack, the ecclesiastical matters in another, and the rare, politically volatile missives in a small box with a leather lid. Still, the bishop read many. Slowly, deliberately. He would break the seals with a brass knife shaped like a fish. He would smooth the parchment with the back of his hand. He read the letter, he signed the decree, he rang the bell, and so it continued, every day, the same quiet governance, not with proclamations, but with initials scrawled in the margins. Tithes, owed in grain, wool, coin, or service, were recorded in ledgers wider than a man's chest, bound in rough leather and smelling of candle soot and ox. These were kept in a locked cabinet beside the bishop's working desk, which itself was covered in a rotating quilt of half-finished ledgers, notations, folded maps, and glossed ecclesiastical rulings. The diocese under his charge was not simply a collection of churches, it was a network of lands, of tenant farms and lease mills, of forests granted to abbots and vineyards held in the names of saints, and every inch of it required oversight. There were canon lawyers in his employ who advised on the finer points of doctrine, especially when church law intersected with local custom. There were treasurers who tracked every incoming offering, every silver penny collected from candle sales, every expense for the repair of chapels or the purchase of new. And there were scribes who copied every letter twice, once for sending, once for record each letter ending with a signature, a date, and a prayer for the recipient's obedience. Their work took place at long tables lined against the outer walls of the administrative chamber, where daylight poured in from high narrow windows, and ink dried slowly in the winter cold. The sound here was never loud, never sudden, just the constant scratch of quills, the occasional clearing of a throat, and the faint, deliberate tapping of a stylus against the lip of a sanjar. The bishop did not rule with violence. He did not ride with soldiers. His power was administrative, and thus, in many ways, more enduring. A monastery that ignored his letters would find its grain allotment delayed. A noble who refused tithe might receive a quiet notice of excommunication, not announced from the pulpit, but enforced by scribes and messengers. A church in disrepair might lose its wine shipment for the Eucharist. These were not punishments, not in name. They were adjustments, calculated with the same precision as the accounting tables themselves. The bishop's influence moved not through speech, but through ledgers. A field withheld, a sum rebalanced, a signature delayed. He read the letter, he signed the decree, he rang the bell. The accounting room was perhaps the most forgotten space in the entire estate, and yet one of the most important. It lay below the administrative chamber, down a short stone staircase lit only by narrow slits in the wall and the occasional oil lamp. Here, two treasurers worked in silence, their heads bent over thick tables scattered with scrolls, tokens, tally sticks, and bound volumes. One man calculated land, knew what had been sown, what harvested, the other tallied offerings, coin, and goods received from parishes under the bishop's care. In the winter, they wore gloves with the fingers cut away, so as not to slow their work. Their lips moved silently as they added columns of numbers. On the shelves behind them, each year's ledger was wrapped in wool cloth and marked with inked tags, showing its scope. There was no gold in this room, no silver laid out in trays. But this room was the treasury. Everything the bishop possessed was recorded here, accounted for in lines and lines of black ink and charcoal numbers. If a scroll tore, it was mended with paste and cloth. If a candle dripped too much wax onto the parchment, the affected area was recopied carefully, without complaint. These scribes did not speak much, but they worked steadily, even after dusk. The bishop rarely entered this room himself, but he knew every ledger's title, and when he summoned a figure from memory, the treasurers retrieved it without delay. Each monastery in the diocese submitted quarterly updates, lists of novices, admitted of fields harvested. These came bundled in leather satchels, brought by young messengers who arrived frostbitten or sweating, depending on the season. The bishop reviewed them one by one, with attention not to volume but to consistency. A monastery whose reports changed too often would receive a formal inquiry. One whose fields lay fallow too long might be reassigned laborers. This was management, not spiritualism. But it was vital to the church's stability, and in the bishop's world, stability was sacred. Even the ink used for writing was managed with care. The treasurers preferred oak gall ink, thick and slow-drying, mixed with iron salts and gum arabic. Each scribe prepared his own supply, storing it in glass-stoppered jars that clinked faintly when handled. Quills were cut fresh each week, knives honed daily. Paper, when used, came from Italy, smoother and whiter than local parchment, and used only for external correspondence. For internal use, vellum was preferred, firmer, longer-lasting, forgiving of scraped corrections. All documents bore the bishop's seal, a small oval of beeswax imprinted with the image of a mitred head and a single word, pox. And still, the work went on, even as the sun set, even as the halls cooled. Couriers came with torches, cloaks wrapped tight, eyes lowered. A decree was read aloud to a small group of clerks. A new land grant was drafted. A book of accounts was passed to the steward for review. The bishop read the letter. He signed the decree. He rang the bell. This was power not loud, not swift, but immovable. It was power in the form of rhythm, in the repetition of phrases, of actions, of rituals shaped not by altar but by record. And yet, this world of scrolls and seals, of numbers and names, was every bit as sacred to the bishop as his chapel. For here, in the slow choreography of administration, was the body of the church made flesh. Not in miracles, but in margins. Not in sermons, but in spreadsheets written by Kant. And so the quill moved, the wax cooled, the water clock ticked. The bishop had taken vows that echoed through every corridor of his palace and every fold of his robe. Humility, chastity, obedience, poverty. And yet, as with so many things whispered in Latin under the vaulted ceilings of stone churches, there was a distance between the words and the world they inhabited, a measured space between what was promised and what was practiced, bridged by ritual, by tradition, by the soft fabric of justification, worn smooth with repetition. Within the walls of the episcopal residence, poverty was not absent, but it was curated, shaped, dressed in formality, and always presented through the lens of sacred purpose. The bishop's robe, worn on high feast days, shimmered faintly even in candlelight, not with vanity, but with brocade, woven with threads of gold, spun so fine they weighed less than wax dust. It was called a chasuble, embroidered at the hem with images of saints, and edged with a trim of crimson silk. Beneath it he wore an alb simple, yes, but hemmed with lace-and around his neck, the stole, sign of his priesthood, heavy with meaning and material both. These garments were stored in a carved chest lined with linen, each piece wrapped in cloth and folded with reverence, not unlike that afforded relics. They were vestments, not clothes. Their beauty, the church taught, was not for the man who wore them, but for the glory of God. The gold was not wealth, it was reverence, and so the illusion held, beyond the chapel, in the residence's long halls. The tension between vow and reality continued in architecture and scent. The walls bore tapestries not for luxury, but for warmth, so the rationale went. But these tapestries depicted scenes of miraculous harvests, of gleaming hallows and richly robed apostles walking among lilies and lions. Their threads were dyed with colors, so rare lapis blue, saffron, yellow, cochineal red that entire villages could not afford a single scrap. In the kitchens, spices perfumed the air, not just the common pungency of onion and garlic, but the elusive fragrances of clove, cinnamon, and nutmeg, imported in small parcels from ports, handled only by trusted hands. kept under lock. These were not used daily, not for the ordinary stews or soups shared by the lower clergy, but they appeared in the bishop's table on feast days, on the occasion of visiting dignitaries, when dishes needed to do more than nourish, they needed to signal. Every object within the bishop's residence whispered this same paradox. The golden crozier, a staff topped with a curled vine and a small enamel depiction of the Good Shepherd, stood at the ready in its place in the sacristy. It was rarely touched, never casually handled, and yet its very presence shaped how the bishop moved through the world. When he walked with it, all eyes turned. When he left it behind, it lingered in the minds of those who had seen it. His mitre, tall and stiff, was lined with silk. His rings, meant to reflect apostolic succession, were studded with small jewels, not ostentatiously. The Church taught that these adornments honored not the man, but the office, the bishop, as successor to the apostles, the representative of holy authority. And perhaps that was true, or perhaps the line was simply blurred, soft, like the edges of worn parchment, hard to define, easy to accept. No one laughed in the bishop's presence. No one commented on the weight of the ring or the shimmer of the vestment. There was no confession of excess, only the rustle of robes behind closed doors. The psychology of this quiet wealth was not one of greed or decadence. It was older, more subtle, a belief that beauty, properly displayed, could uplift the soul, that when the faithful entered a cathedral and saw the altar gleam with gold leaf, or smelled the rare sweetness of incense, they would feel closer to heaven, that a chalice crusted in emeralds could carry not indulgence, but the very blood of Christ. In this worldview, ornamentation was not corruption. It was theology in metal and thread. And so the bishop lived surrounded by reminders of divine abundance, scrolls carefully copied with gilded letters, chairs carved with the symbols of the evangelists, doors inlaid with small panels of ivory. He did not deny these things. He simply moved within them. They were background, part of the sacred space, a soft and constant presence, like the echo of a chant in a tall stone nave. The bishop rarely spoke of wealth. He did not need to. It was managed by stewards, distributed by treasurers, recorded by scribes. His job was not to question whether the walls of his palace should be painted with scenes of paradise, or whether the windows should be glazed in colored glass. His role was to ensure that the sacred continued, that the books were copied, the schools funded, the relics protected, and if that meant sleeping beneath a painted ceiling, so be it. The ceiling of his bedchamber, high above the curtained bed, depicted a night sky filled with stars, each rendered in gold on a field of dark blue. It was not realistic, it was devotional, a reminder, perhaps, that even in sleep, the bishop was watched over. Even in silence, there was purpose. The contradiction was not hidden. It was simply not discussed. Those who swept the bishop as holes knew the smell of the imported oil used in his lamp. Those who washed his garments knew the texture of silk. Those who copied his letters knew the smoothness of Italian but no one called it extravagance. It was simply how things were. And in a world where monasteries fed the hungry, where churches offered warmth and medicine to the sick, where the bishop's authority kept the peace among quarrelsome nobles, perhaps the comfort of his stone walls and layered robes seemed a small thing. Or perhaps not, but in either case, the silence remained. He walked each day along cloistered corridors, lined with candle niches and irons. He passed beneath arches carved with saints whose names even he sometimes forgot. He nodded to servants who bowed and vanished into doorways. He entered chapels, council rooms, libraries. He read letters, he signed decrees. He rang the bell, and each night he returned to his room, where the fire was already lit, the curtains drawn, the candle wick trimmed. He unfastened the brooch at his throat. He removed the rings, one by one. He folded the stole, kissed the crucifix, and set it down. He offered a final prayer, not loud, not rushed. A prayer he had spoken so many times it no longer needed to be heard to be true. Then he lay down on a bed, not bare, but made up with sheets, woven from fine flax, smoothed by hands, trained to smooth. And there, in a stone room beneath a painted ceiling, he slept, with a prayer on his lips, and silk on his pillow. And now, the candles burn low, their flames softening to embers, their wax curled in the saucers like fallen petals. The air has settled, the last quill has rested, the last footstep has faded into the cloister shadows, and we arrive, gently, at the end not of a story, but of many threads, braided loosely together, woven not for resolution, but for reflection. You've wandered tonight through 4 silences, each draped in its own robe, each shaped by the time that bore it. and each asking something different of the soul that lived within it. The first was the silence of the monk, cloaked in coarse bell, wrapped in the rhythm of bells and prayers, of ink-stained fingers and aching knees on cold flagstone. His silence was learned, endured, embraced, born, not of serenity, but of surrender, of rule and ritual and the slow erosion of self. In his world, words were rare and worth less than obedience. He did not speak to shape the world, but to disappear into it. And you felt I too walked beside him in the half-light. You scrubbed latrines by candlelight. You bent over herb beds in the garden. And you rose again at 2 a.m. because the bell demanded it. A life that asked for everything, yet promised little in return but rhythm. Then you heard another silence, sharper, more final, the silence of Jan Hus, spoken in clarity, extinguished in flame. His words had once filled halls, simple and plain. A teacher's voice in check that turned the great machine of the church uneasy. He did not shout. He did not march. He stood, and for that, he burned. His silence was not chosen, but imposed. Yet even there, in chains, beneath the weight of betrayal, he did not scream. He offered no final defiance. Only stillness. Only the slow hush of straw being laid at his feet, the whisper of prayers mouthed as smoke thickened in the morning air. And then the silence deepened again, not of martyrdom, nor of labor, but of something stranger still. The silence of the Voynich manuscript. Unread, it asked nothing, offered nothing, but endured. You ran your fingers over its vellum, imagined the ghost plants blooming in ink, the women in pools, the wheels of stars. You sat with it, and it asked you only to listen, not for meaning, but for mood. It did not reveal, it simply existed, like a psalm without translation, like a breath in the dark, a silence, not of absence, but of presence. And finally, you stood behind the bishop's high-backed chair and watched his quill move over parchment. His silence, unlike the monk's, was not obedience. Unlike Huss's, not punishment. Unlike the manuscripts, not mystery. His was the silence of control, spoken in wax seals and grain tallies, in ceremonial robes and imported spices that never touched his lips. He ruled in quiet, his footsteps muffled by rushes, his judgments written, not voiced. Even the wealth around him whispered. The gold on his chalice said nothing. The painted ceiling above his bed said nothing. But power flowed through him nonetheless, steady and quiet as a winter stream beneath ice. And now, as your breath slows, as your body sinks deeper into stillness, you may feel these silences pressing gently around you. Not threatening, not lonely, just present. They do not ask you to choose between them. They do not seek judgment or conclusion. They simply invite you to rest beside them. And so, across centuries, silence wore many robes, burlap, ash, parchment, gold, but still, it was silence, and tonight, it keeps you company. It does not stir. It does not scold. It waits beside your bed, as it waited in cloisters and chapels, at pyres and scriptoriums, in halls of stone, and rooms of firelight. You are far from the bells, far from the trial, far from the ink. Nothing is demanded of you. Not obedience, not courage, not interpretation. Only rest. Let the parchment close. Let the robe fall still. Let the night carry you. And when the bell tolls again, let it toll far, far away.